Dear friends, only full books are published here. Enjoy. Chapter 1, The Letter. The first thing Elena noticed about the town of Greyhaven was the silence. It was not the ordinary quiet of a sleepy coastal village. It was deeper than that. The kind of silence that seemed to sit in the air like mist, as if the town itself were holding its breath. The bus left her at the edge of the harbor just before sunset. When the doors folded shut and the engine groaned away down the road, Elena stood alone with her suitcase beside her and watched the last orange light of evening spread across the water. The sea looked calm. But there was something uneasy in the rhythm of the waves. Elena wrapped her coat tighter around herself. The wind smelled of salt and rain. Somewhere nearby a buoy bell clanged softly. Greyhaven. She had not planned to come here. Until the letter arrived. The envelope had been waiting for her 3 weeks earlier when she returned home from work. It sat alone on the small wooden table inside her apartment, as if it had been placed there carefully. No return address. Just her name written in neat, old-fashioned handwriting. She remembered how long she stared at it before opening it. Something about the envelope made her uneasy. Inside was a single sheet of paper. And one sentence. If you want to know the truth about your father, come to Greyhaven. There was no signature. Just an address. The address of a house by the sea. Elena had read the letter at least 20 times. Her father had died 12 years ago. Or at least that was what everyone told her. The police had said his boat had capsized during a storm. His body was never found. For years Elena tried to accept that explanation. But there were always questions. Unanswered ones. And now this letter. She almost ignored it. Almost. But curiosity had a way of growing quietly until it became impossible to silence. So now she stood in Greyhaven with the wind tugging at her hair and the sea whispering behind her. And somewhere in this town, someone knew something about her father. A seagull cried above the harbor. Elena picked up her suitcase. The town itself looked small. A narrow street ran along the waterfront. Old stone buildings leaned slightly toward the sea, their windows glowing faintly with warm yellow light. There were a few people walking along the docks. Fishermen mostly. None of them looked at her for long. But she felt their eyes. The quiet curiosity reserved for strangers. Elena walked slowly along the harbor. The address in the letter was not far. She had checked the map several times on the bus. Cliff Road. At the far end of town. The house overlooked the sea. The wind grew stronger as she walked. Night was coming quickly now. Gray clouds rolled low across the sky. By the time she reached the end of the harbor, the town behind her had begun to fade into shadow. Cliff Road climbed gently upward along the coastline. The sound of the waves became louder. Elena followed the narrow path. Her footsteps echoed against the stones. She began to wonder who had written the letter. And why now? 12 years was a long time to keep a secret. The road curved once. Then twice. And then she saw the house. It stood alone at the edge of the cliffs. A tall, weathered structure of dark wood and stone. Its windows faced the ocean. One light burned inside. Elena stopped walking. For a moment she simply stood there, watching the house. The wind lifted strands of her dark hair across her face. She brushed them away slowly. Something about the house felt familiar. But she knew that was impossible. She had never been here before. At least she didn't think she had. The gate creaked when she pushed it open. The small garden had grown wild. Tall grass moved restlessly in the wind. Elena walked up the stone path toward the front door. Her heart was beating faster now. She raised her hand. And knocked. For several seconds nothing happened. Only the wind and the distant roar of the sea. Then she heard footsteps inside. Slow ones. The door opened. A tall man stood in the doorway. He looked to be in his early 30s. Dark hair, gray eyes, and the calm expression of someone who had been expecting her. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then he said quietly, "You must be Elena." She blinked in surprise. "Yes." He stepped aside slightly. "I wondered when you would arrive." His voice was deep and steady. "Did you write the letter?" Elena asked. The man hesitated. "Come inside," he said. "You must be cold." Elena did not move immediately. Something in his expression made her uneasy. But curiosity pushed her forward. She stepped into the house. The warmth inside felt comforting after the wind outside. A fire burned in a stone fireplace. The room smelled faintly of cedar wood and old books. The man closed the door behind her. "I'm Daniel," he said. "Elena." "Yes." He studied her face for a moment. "You look very much like him." Her stomach tightened. "My father?" Daniel nodded slowly. Elena set her suitcase down. "You knew him?" It was not a question. "Yes." "How?" Daniel walked toward the fireplace and rested one hand on the mantel. "I worked with him," he said. "Worked?" "At sea." Elena frowned. "My father was a marine engineer." "Yes. That's what everyone said." Daniel looked into the fire for a moment. Then he turned back toward her. "But that wasn't the whole truth." The room suddenly felt smaller. "What do you mean?" Daniel hesitated again, as if choosing his words carefully. "Your father," he said quietly, "was searching for something." Elena felt a strange chill. Searching for what? Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead he walked toward a small wooden desk near the window. He opened one of the drawers and removed a worn leather notebook. He placed it gently on the table. This belonged to him. Elena stared at it. Her father's handwriting was on the cover. She would recognize it anywhere. Her throat tightened. "Where did you get that?" Daniel met her eyes. "He left it here." "When?" "The night he disappeared." The fire crackled softly behind them. Outside, the wind howled against the cliffs. Elena felt her heart beating faster. "My father died in a storm." Daniel shook his head slowly. "No." The word landed in the room like a falling stone. Elena took a step toward him. "What are you saying?" Daniel's voice remained calm. "I'm saying your father didn't die that night." Silence filled the room. Elena could barely breathe. "That's impossible." Daniel slid the notebook toward her. "Read it." Her hands trembled slightly as she picked it up. The pages smelled faintly of salt and age. The first entries were ordinary. Weather notes. Coordinates. Observations about currents. But then the writing changed. The entries became shorter. More urgent. Elena turned to the final page. And froze. Her father's last words were written there. "If anything happens to me, Elena must never come to Greyhaven." Her pulse pounded in her ears. Slowly she looked up at Daniel. "Then why did you send the letter?" For the first time since she arrived, Daniel's calm expression cracked. "Just slightly." "Because," he said quietly, "someone else is looking for what he found." Outside the window, lightning flashed far out over the ocean. The storm was coming. And Elena had the sudden, terrifying feeling that arriving in Greyhaven might have been the worst mistake of her life. Chapter 2: The Notebook and the Storm. Elena did not realize she was still gripping the notebook until Daniel reached out, very slowly, and placed another log on the fire. The small sound of wood settling into flame brought her back into the room. Rain had begun outside. It tapped against the windows at first in a light, uncertain pattern, then harder, as if the storm had found its courage. The sea below the cliffs answered with a low, restless roar. She looked down again at the last page. If anything happens to me, Elena must never come to Greyhaven. The words seemed to shift each time she read them. Her father's handwriting had always been clean and patient. Even as a child, she used to watch him make notes in small black journals and admire how even his hurried words looked steady. But this line was different. The letters pressed deep into the page, as if he had written them under strain. "You're asking me to believe," she said at last, her voice tight, "that my father survived the storm that supposedly killed him, but also left this behind, saying I should never come here." Daniel stayed where he was, one hand resting on the edge of the desk. "Yes. That makes no sense." "I know." She looked up sharply. "No, I don't think you do." The calm in his face remained, but there was a heaviness in it now. Not indifference. Not coldness. Something more difficult. Regret, perhaps. Or the knowledge that truth, once spoken aloud, never arrived in a clean shape. "Elena," he said quietly, "I knew this would be hard to hear." "You knew?" A breathless laugh escaped her, almost unbelieving. "You knew?" She closed the notebook with more force than she intended and placed it back on the table. 12 years, she said. 12 years I believed my father was dead. I went to a funeral without a body. I listened to people say all the things they say when they don't know what else to do with someone's grief. I packed his clothes. I sold his tools. I kept 2 of his sweaters because they still smelled like salt and cedar and machine oil, and eventually even that faded. Her throat tightened. "And now you say he didn't die?" Daniel did not try to interrupt her. That, somehow, made it worse. "Who are you?" she demanded. "Really?" He took a breath before answering. "My full name is Daniel Vale. I grew up here. My father owned one of the last repair yards in Greyhaven. Your father came to him when he needed discreet mechanical work done on his boat. That's how I met him." Elena folded her arms tightly, partly against the cold that seemed to have entered her from nowhere, and partly because she needed something to hold together. "How old were you?" 21. "And my father trusted you?" "Eventually." She gave him a disbelieving look. "Enough to leave his notebook in your house?" Daniel glanced toward the room around them as if only then remembering what this place must look like to her. "This wasn't always my house," he said. "It belonged to my aunt. She let him use it when he needed privacy." Elena turned slowly, seeing the room with new eyes. There were shelves full of books along one wall, an old telescope near the far window, a thick wool blanket folded over the arm of a chair. The furniture was sturdy and plain, worn smooth by years of use. Nothing in it looked careless. Nothing looked accidental. This house belonged to someone else back then? "Yes. And you just happened to be here the night he disappeared." Daniel held her gaze. "Yes." Lightning flashed again, nearer this time, briefly painting the room silver. A second later thunder rolled over the sea and shook the windows. Elena hated thunderstorms. Not the sound, exactly. Not even the lightning. It was the waiting between them that unsettled her. The held breath before impact. She moved toward the fireplace without thinking, drawn by warmth, and stood with her back to it. "Start at the beginning," she said. "No more half-truths." Daniel nodded once. He arrived in Greyhaven about 14 years ago. At first he told everyone he was studying old tide patterns and coastal erosion. That part wasn't entirely false. He rented boats, spoke to fishermen, asked questions about the cliffs, currents, and old ship routes. Most people thought he was eccentric, but harmless. "Elaborate," Elena said. A faint, fleeting almost smile touched Daniel's mouth. He had a habit of asking dangerous questions in a cheerful tone. Despite everything, the image struck something tender in her chest. That sounded like him. Her father had always been gentle in manner, but relentless in curiosity. Even when she was a child, he would kneel beside broken appliances, clocks, radios, and explain that every mystery looked impossible until you learned how it was built. What was he really looking for, she asked. Daniel's expression grew serious again. A vessel. Elena stared at him. A vessel, she repeated. You mean a ship? Yes. A ship that sank off this coast a very long time ago. She let out a breath. That's it? My father vanished because of a shipwreck? Not just any shipwreck. Daniel crossed to one of the shelves and took down a thin folder, old and softened at the edges. He opened it on the table beside the notebook and turned it toward her. Inside were copies of maps, sketches, and a few photographs so faded they looked like memories more than images. On the first page was a charcoal drawing of a three-masted vessel in violent seas. Beneath it, written in a careful hand. The Orpheline. Lost, October 1889. Cargo not recovered. Elena, Daniel said, your father believed the Orpheline carried something that was never listed in the official manifests. She glanced through the pages. Smugglers? That was one theory. And yours? He was quiet long enough that she lifted her eyes. I'm not sure anymore. The answer, because it sounded honest, unsettled her more than certainty might have. Rain hammered the glass. The storm had fully arrived now, enclosing the house in water and darkness. She turned another page. There were translated fragments from letters, notes about local families, old headlines, names repeated more than once. Some were underlined. Crossings. Lantern signals. Missing ledger. Cliff House. What is all this? Pieces, Daniel said. Your father spent years gathering them. Oral history. Harbor logs. Old court records. Stories people told after too much whiskey and then denied the next morning. Elena touched one of the copied pages. And he believed all of it led to this ship. Yes. And this secret cargo. Yes. She looked at him. What kind of cargo causes someone to fake a death? Daniel's jaw tightened. He never told me exactly what he thought it was. Not until the end. And even then, he looked away briefly toward the window, where water blurred the black outline of the sea. Even then I think he knew more than he wanted to say. Elena felt her pulse rise again. Then say what you do know. Daniel was still for a long moment. At first he believed the ship carried a set of private documents, he said at last. Correspondence. Ledgers. Proof of a network of smuggling and bribery involving families here in Greyhaven and men in the city. Powerful men. Men whose descendants still control property, business, and local politics. Elena frowned. That sounds like a scandal, not a life worth disappearing for. It would have been enough for some people. But not for you. No. She waited. The final winter before he vanished, he changed, Daniel said. He became more careful. He stopped writing certain details in his notes. He began using false names when he asked questions in town. He told me once that if he was right, the papers were only part of it. Daniel's voice lowered. He thought there was something else aboard the Orpheline. Something hidden even from most of the crew. A treasure? The word felt childish as soon as she said it, but Daniel did not laugh. Possibly, he said. Though not in the way people usually mean. What does that mean? It means your father cared less about value than about truth. If there was gold, he barely mentioned it. If there were jewels, he ignored them. But records, Daniel tapped the notebook. Proof. Motive. History buried on purpose. That mattered to him. That sounded like her father too. He used to say that objects could be replaced, but truth, once hidden long enough, altered people's lives. As a child she never understood what he meant. Now she wondered if perhaps he had been speaking from experience all along. She sank slowly into the armchair beside the fire. The room was warm, but fatigue was starting to settle behind her eyes. She had been traveling since morning. She had hardly eaten. And now her grief, carefully arranged and lived with for years, had been broken open and scattered like glass. Daniel noticed. "You should have some tea," he said. "I'm not hungry." "Tea is not food." "I know what tea is." Again that almost smile. It softened his face unexpectedly, making him look less like a gatekeeper of old secrets and more like a man who was trying, with limited success, not to make things worse. "Stay angry if you like," he said, moving toward the kitchen alcove at the back of the room. "But have tea while you do it." Elena almost refused on principle. But the rain had made the house feel adrift, and the sound of a kettle being filled carried with it a domestic gentleness that cut strangely through her fear. She watched him in silence. He moved efficiently, without noise, as if he knew the house so well that he did not need to think about where anything was. He lit the stove, set the kettle on, reached for mugs from a shelf. His shirt sleeves were rolled halfway up his forearms. There was a small scar just above his wrist. Another near his thumb. A man who worked with his hands, she thought. That should not have mattered. And yet the sight of steadiness in another person could feel dangerously close to comfort. She looked away before he turned back. When he returned with tea, he set one mug on the small table beside her and took the chair opposite. For a minute neither of them spoke. The fire flickered. Rain beat at the windows. Somewhere deeper in the house, old wood adjusted itself with a faint creak. Elena wrapped both hands around the mug. "What exactly did my father find?" she asked at last. Daniel looked into his own tea. "Coordinates. That sounds important." It was. He had spent years narrowing down a search area off the western reef. Most divers who looked for the Orphaline searched too far north because they trusted the official storm reports. Your father believed the reports had been altered. Altered by whom? That was one of the questions that got him into trouble. She let the words settle. Trouble with who? Daniel looked up. With people who had learned he was close. Lightning flashed again. Thunder followed almost at once. The storm was nearly overhead now. Elena listened to it for a moment, then said, "Names." Daniel's expression changed. Not quite hesitation. Something sharper. "I only know some of them." "Then start there." He set down his mug. "There is a family here called Mercer." "The Mercer shipping Mercers?" "You know the name." "Of course I know the name. They own half the marina in the next city. They own more than that." Daniel leaned back slightly. Greyhaven was smaller once. Poorer. The Mercers made money in shipping generations ago, then property, then tourism. Old names here have a way of surviving even when the truth around them changes. And my father thought they were connected to the ship. Yes. Why? Because the Orphaline vanished on a route that should not have brought it near Greyhaven. Because someone paid to have certain harbor ledgers removed from county archives in the 1920s. Because land near these cliffs changed hands quietly and repeatedly among the same three families for almost a century. He paused. And because your father found references to a woman named Isabel Mercer in letters from 1889. A woman. Yes. What about her? Daniel's gaze seemed to drift briefly elsewhere, as if he were seeing not the room but some older image laid over it. According to local rumor, Isabel was engaged to marry a magistrate's son. Instead she disappeared the same month the Orphaline sank. Elena frowned. That sounds like a ghost story. It does. And your father hated ghost stories, Daniel said. Which is how I knew he took it seriously. Despite herself, Elena let out a small breath that might have been the beginning of a laugh. That does sound like him. The words escaped before she could stop them. Both of them noticed. Something quiet shifted in the room. Daniel's eyes softened, though only for a second. He spoke of you often. Elena's fingers tightened around the mug. Did he? Yes. The storm seemed to recede, not in sound but in importance. What did he say? Daniel answered carefully, perhaps aware that any wrong word would matter. He said you used to fall asleep in the workshop when you were small. He would build things at night, and you'd insist on staying with him. He'd make a bed from old sailcloth or blankets. Half the time you'd fight sleep, and half the time he'd look down and find you already gone. The image rose with painful clarity. A lamp burning late. The smell of wood shavings and oil. Her father's hands fitting something together while she lay curled in a corner pretending to be awake. She swallowed. He told you that? Daniel nodded. He said you asked impossible questions. A smile touched her mouth before she could stop it. I still do. I noticed. For the first time since arriving, the room felt less like a place she had been brought into and more like one she was inhabiting. Which was dangerous. She knew better than to trust the person holding most of the information. Still, warmth had a way of working quietly. Firelight. Tea. A voice low enough not to scrape against her nerves. Even suspicion needed rest sometimes. She set down the mug. If he trusted you enough to tell you stories about me, why didn't you tell me any of this sooner? Daniel was silent long enough that the answer began to form on its own. Because you were told not to. He met her eyes. Yes. And you listened. Yes. Anger rose again, but slower this time, tangled with the ache of being spoken of in her absence, protected without permission. He asked you to keep me away. He asked me to protect you. That is not the same thing. No, Daniel said softly. It isn't. She stood and walked to the window. Rain blurred everything beyond the glass. The dark sea and darker sky had nearly merged, separated only when lightning briefly outlined the waves in pale blue-white. Her reflection hovered faintly in the windowpane, dark hair loosened by travel, tired eyes, a face she suddenly searched for traces of her father in. When did you decide to break your promise? She asked. Behind her, the fire shifted and popped. A month ago, Daniel said. She turned. Why a month ago? His face had gone still again, but this time it was not detachment. It was the look of a man deciding whether one truth could be told before another. Because someone broke into the boathouse. Elena stared at him. What boathouse? The one your father used at the old cove below the eastern ridge. Did they steal anything? I don't know. That's not an answer. It's the only honest one. He stood. The place had been untouched for years. Or so I believed. Then I found the lock cut, the floorboards pried open, and the chart cabinet smashed. A cold sensation moved through her, sharper than fear and harder to name. Were the coordinates there? Daniel's voice was quiet. Possibly. Possibly? He stepped closer to the desk, opened the notebook again, and showed her several torn-out stubs near the back. There were pages missing long before you arrived. She looked from the notebook to him. You didn't tell me that. I'm telling you now. Convenient. His jaw tightened. You think I'm lying. I think you have chosen your timing very carefully. A beat of silence. That's fair, he said. She had expected defensiveness. The lack of it made her feel suddenly tired. She turned away again and looked out at the storm. Somewhere below the cliffs, waves struck rock with a sound like doors closing. Say it plainly, she said. Why did you send for me? Because if the pages are gone, then there are only two ways to find what your father hid. She waited. The first is through the places he wrote about in code. And the second? Daniel held her gaze. You. The room seemed to narrow around that single word. Elena frowned. What is that supposed to mean? Your father believed memory could survive where paper failed. He left patterns. Repetitions. References to things only someone close to him might recognize. That's absurd. Is it? Read the notebook again tomorrow, when you're less exhausted. She wanted to argue. But exhaustion was exactly right. Her thoughts were beginning to blur at their edges. Daniel seemed to notice her swaying slightly, because his voice gentled. There's a room upstairs, he said. You can rest tonight, and in the morning. No. He stopped. I'm not sleeping here because you say so, she said. You shouldn't go back out in this storm. I can find an inn. In Greyhaven? In weather like this? At this hour? He shook his head. The only inn in town closed for repairs last week. There are rooms above the Anchor, but they're usually rented to ferry workers, and even if one is free, the harbor road floods in heavy rain. She hated that he probably wasn't exaggerating. I'll take the sofa, she said. You won't. It sags in the middle and will ruin your back. She stared at him. He lifted one shoulder, almost apologetically. It does. Against all reason, a tired laugh left her. It surprised both of them. The storm moved across the roof in a long shuddering wave. I don't trust you, she said. I know. But I'm too tired to leave. I know that too. Something in his tone, matter of fact, not triumphant, took the edge from the moment. He picked up her suitcase from beside the door. The room is at the end of the hall. You can lock it. I was going to. That's why I mentioned it. She followed him up the stairs. The house creaked softly with each step. The upper hallway was narrow, lined with framed sketches of the sea, cliffs in winter, fishing boats in fog, gulls above a black horizon. At the far end he opened a door and stepped aside. The room was simple and unexpectedly warm. A brass bed with a quilt folded neatly over it. A small writing desk beneath the window. A pitcher and basin. A lamp. Pale curtains lifting slightly in the draft. It was my aunt's room, Daniel said. I changed the linens this morning. This morning, Elena repeated. I hoped you'd come today. A strange stillness passed through her. He had prepared for her. The thought should have unnerved her more than it did. Instead it left her with the odd sensation of having stepped into a story that had already begun before she arrived. Daniel set the suitcase just inside the room. I'm downstairs if you need anything. Such as a better explanation? A shadow of weariness crossed his face. Tomorrow. She nodded once. He started to leave, then paused at the doorway. Elena. She looked at him. When you were very young, he said, did your father ever tell you a story about the sea giving back what it takes? The question caught her off guard. Maybe, she said slowly. I don't remember. Daniel's expression became unreadable again. Try. Before she could ask why, he stepped back and closed the door. A second later she heard his footsteps retreat down the hall. Elena crossed the room and turned the lock. Then she stood still, listening. The storm pressed against the house from all sides. Rain. Wind. The dull vibration of thunder moving farther out over the water. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands. They were trembling. Not from cold now. From the delayed shock of everything she had heard. Her father alive. Or once alive after the storm. A hidden ship. Missing pages. A broken boathouse. Codes. Mercers. A vanished woman. A promise broken. And this house, with its watchful windows and old wooden heart, holding more of him than she had found in 12 years. She rose and unpacked only what she needed, her nightdress, her toothbrush, the small pouch of medicines and hairpins, the book she had brought for the journey and never opened. When she caught sight of herself in the small mirror over the basin, she hardly recognized the expression looking back. She looked younger when she was frightened. She hated that. After washing, she changed and slipped under the quilt. It smelled faintly of lavender and cold cotton dried indoors. She blew out the lamp. Darkness settled around her, but not fully. There was enough storm light through the curtains to shape the room in gray. She closed her eyes. Sleep did not come. Thoughts rose and broke against one another. Her father's handwriting. Daniel's voice saying he spoke of you often. The folder of papers. The name Isabel Mercer. The question at the doorway. Did your father ever tell you a story about the sea giving back what it takes? Something stirred at the edge of memory. Not words at first. A feeling. Warmth. Wool blanket. Her cheek against someone's shoulder. The sound of waves. Then, slowly, a voice from long ago. The sea keeps secrets, Lena girl. But not forever. Her eyes opened. She sat up in bed. The room was still dark, the storm quieter now, but her heart was beating too fast. Lena girl. He had called her that only when she was little. She pressed a hand to her mouth. Another fragment surfaced. Not just his voice. A room. Not her childhood apartment. Not his workshop in the city. Somewhere else. A window rattling in the wind. A lamp with yellow glass. And beyond the window, a black sea. Elena's breath caught. Had she been here before? No. Or, not exactly here. But somewhere like this. Somewhere on the coast. She pushed the blankets aside and crossed to the window. Rain still traced the panes, but the thunder had moved farther down the shore. In the dark below, waves flashed white where they met the rocks. Memory was treacherous at night. She knew that. Half of it was invention. The mind stitched fear and longing together until they wore each other's faces. Still, the sense of familiarity would not leave her. She was reaching for the curtain when a light moved below. Elena froze. There, near the side of the house, a narrow beam of yellow swung once across the grass and vanished. Not lightning. A lantern. She held her breath. Several seconds passed. Then the light appeared again, lower this time, moving toward the path that led away from the house and down toward the cliffs. Someone was outside. Her first thought was Daniel. But why would he be walking the cliffs in the middle of a storm? And why with a hooded lantern instead of an electric torch? She moved closer to the glass. The light paused. A figure stood at the edge of the garden wall, half hidden by rain and darkness. Too far to make out clearly. Broad-shouldered perhaps, but that might have been the coat. Then the figure turned. For one impossible second Elena had the wild thought that the person looked up directly at her window. The lantern went out. She jerked back from the glass. Her heart pounded hard enough to hurt. She stayed very still, listening. Nothing. Only the wind, weaker now, and the endless sea below. She did not know how long she stood there before she made up her mind. Then, barefoot and wrapped in the quilt like a cloak, she crossed the room, unlocked the door, and stepped into the hallway. A line of dim light showed beneath the door at the far end of the hall. Daniel was still awake. She went downstairs more quickly than quietly, but by the time she reached the last step the house had already alerted him to her presence. The study door opened before she reached it. Daniel looked up from the desk inside. He had removed his jacket. A lamp burned beside an open chart spread across the table. He rose at once when he saw her. What happened? There was someone outside. His expression sharpened instantly. Where? By the garden wall. They had a lantern. He was moving before she finished. He took a heavy flashlight from a hook near the door, shrugged into his coat, and reached for another lamp. No, Elena said, following him. Don't just go out there alone. You'd rather I let them stay? I'd rather you not disappear into the dark after telling me people might be searching for my father's notes. He stopped long enough to look at her. Then, with visible effort, he handed her the flashlight. "Stay inside," he said. "Lock the door behind me. If I'm not back in 10 minutes, call the constable in town. The number's by the telephone." Elena took the flashlight but did not move. "Daniel." His gaze held hers. In the stronger lamplight he looked tired for the first time. Not weak. Not uncertain. Simply worn by long vigilance. "I won't go far," he said. Before she could answer, he stepped out into the night. Cold air rushed in with him, wet and sharp with salt. She watched through the narrow opening as he moved quickly across the garden and toward the path, one hand shielding the lantern from rain. The beam of light swept once over the grass, over stone, over the bent dark shape of shrubs in the wind. Then he was swallowed by darkness. Elena locked the door. The click sounded much too small. She stood in the entry with the flashlight in one hand and her pulse racing. The house felt different now. Not warm and watchful. Listening. She tried to force herself to breathe slowly. 10 minutes, he had said. She counted them badly. At 3 minutes she was sure she heard footsteps at the side of the house. At 5 she thought the doorknob moved. At 7 she nearly unlocked the door herself just to make the waiting stop. At 8 she heard nothing but rainwater dripping from the eaves. At 9 a noise came from upstairs. Elena spun toward the staircase. The sound came again. A soft, distinct creak. Not the general settling of old wood this time. A step. Someone was upstairs. She switched off the flashlight by instinct, plunging the entry into shadow, and stood perfectly still. Another creak. From the hallway above. Her mind tried to explain it away. The house adjusting. Her imagination. The storm. Then came the faintest sound of all. A door opening. Every hair along her arms rose. Daniel was outside. She was alone in the house. And someone was upstairs. Elena forced herself to move without sound. The fireplace had burned low, and the study lamp spilled only a weak oval of light across the floorboards. She edged backward until she could reach the umbrella stand by the door. It held a walking stick with a brass handle. Not much. Better than nothing. She took it in one hand, the flashlight in the other, and turned toward the stairs. Her mouth was dry. The house was so quiet now that she could hear the rain outside in separate streams. Another floorboard murmured above. Elena climbed one step. Then another. The staircase groaned under her weight, and she froze. No movement above. She kept going. At the top, the hallway lay in near darkness. The only light came from her bedroom, where she had left the curtain slightly open. Pale stormglow outlined the doorway. Her own door was wider open than when she left it. She knew she had closed it. Slowly, Elena lifted the flashlight. And switched it on. The beam cut through the darkness. Empty hall. Empty floorboards. Her room open at the end. She moved toward it, every nerve straining. The brass-handled stick shook slightly in her grip. At her doorway she stopped and shone the light inside. The bed was unmade. The window was still latched. Nothing moved. She stepped in. At first she thought nothing had changed. Then the beam landed on the writing desk beneath the window. And her breath caught. Lying at the center of the desk, where there had been nothing before, was a single white envelope. Her name was written on it. In the same neat, old-fashioned handwriting as the first letter. Elena. For a second she could not move. The flashlight trembled. The storm seemed very far away. She set down the stick, picked up the envelope with cold fingers, and turned it over. No seal. Inside was one folded page. She opened it. Just one sentence. Ask Daniel what really happened at Blackstone Cove. A sound behind her made her whirl around so quickly the flashlight beam leapt across the wall. Daniel stood in the doorway, breathing hard from the cold. His hair was wet from rain. His lantern cast a low circle of gold around his boots. Elena. He stopped when he saw the paper in her hand. Then his face changed. Not to confusion. Not surprise. Recognition. A long, dreadful silence opened between them. Elena stared at him. You said you didn't know who sent the letters, she whispered. Daniel did not answer. Lightning flashed beyond the window, filling the room with white. The paper shook in her hand. What happened at Blackstone Cove? She asked. Daniel's voice, when it came, was low and strained. That, he said, is the part of the story I was hoping to delay. And in the silence after those words, Elena understood one thing with chilling certainty. Whatever tied her father to Greyhaven, whatever secret slept under the waves or in the old records of this town, Daniel was not merely a witness to it. He was inside it. And he had been from the beginning. Chapter 3, Blackstone Cove. For a long moment, Elena could not feel the floor beneath her feet. Daniel remained in the doorway, rainwater still darkening the shoulders of his coat, the lantern hanging loose in one hand. The yellow light from it swayed faintly, sending shadows across the room. He looked at the letter in her hand as if he had seen a ghost. Not because the paper itself frightened him. Because of what it named. Blackstone Cove. Elena's voice, when she found it, was quieter than she expected. You knew this would happen. Daniel's jaw tightened. No. But you're not surprised. His eyes lifted to hers, steady but troubled. I'm surprised by the timing. That is not comforting. No, he said softly. I imagine it isn't. The house seemed to hold itself around them. The storm had begun to drift farther down the coast, but wind still pressed at the walls and windows with restless force. Somewhere below, the sea struck rock in slow, heavy bursts. Elena looked down again at the letter. The handwriting was almost identical to the first note. Careful. Controlled. Beautiful, in a distant and almost impersonal way. She folded the page once. Then again. Tell me, she said. Daniel did not move. Now. He set the lantern on the floor beside the door and closed it behind him. The click of the latch sounded too final. Elena. No, she raised a hand. Do not do that thing where you say my name first and then decide how much truth I'm allowed to hear. He went very still. The silence between them sharpened. Then he nodded once. All right. He crossed the room slowly, giving her space as if he understood that any sudden movement might break what little calm remained. He pulled the desk chair away from the window but did not sit. Blackstone Cove is north of the harbor, he said. A narrow inlet hidden between the cliffs. Hard to see from the water unless you know exactly where to look. At low tide there's a strip of black stone exposed beneath the cliffs. That's where the name comes from. And my father went there. Yes. When? Daniel's gaze drifted briefly to the rain-streaked window. The last night I saw him. A tightness moved through Elena's chest. You said he left the notebook here that night. He did. And then he went to Blackstone Cove? Yes. With you? A pause. Yes. She stared at him. Then why were you hoping to delay that part? Because once I tell you the rest, you'll have reason not to trust me at all. That ship has sailed. A flicker of something passed over his face, wryness, perhaps, under the strain. But it vanished almost instantly. Elena, he said quietly, I didn't betray your father. She folded her arms, the letter still in one hand. You don't get to say that before I know what happened. No, he agreed. I suppose I don't. He drew a breath. The night your father disappeared began like many others that winter. Quiet. Too quiet, actually. Storms had kept most people ashore for days, so the harbor was half empty. He came here just after dusk. A memory seemed to overtake his voice. Not enough to make him lose it, but enough to lower it, soften it. He was restless. Not frightened exactly, but sharpened. Like a man who had been waiting years for one door to open and suddenly heard the lock move. Elena held herself very still. He told me he had finally solved the pattern in the coast charts, Daniel continued. Not the wreck itself. Not yet. But the route to a place connected to it. A place he believed had been used before and after the sinking. Blackstone Cove. Yes. Daniel glanced toward the notebook on the bedside table where Elena had left it earlier. He had suspected for months that someone had been using the cove at night. Small boats. Lantern signals. Nothing frequent enough to prove, but enough to suggest old habits had never fully died. Smuggling. That was his word for it. And you went with him? I insisted. Why? Because he was going alone. That never stopped him before, apparently. A shadow crossed Daniel's features. No. He continued before she could press further. We left around 10. No moon. Cold enough that the ropes on the skiff felt stiff in your hands. The sea was rough but manageable if you stayed close to the rock line. His gaze seemed to settle somewhere beyond her shoulder, on the scene only he could see. When we reached the cove, there was no one there at first. Just the tide going out and the cliffs rising black above us. Elena could almost see it with him. The hidden inlet. Wet stone. Breath turning pale in the dark. What happened next? We found evidence that someone had been there before us. Fresh rope marks on an old mooring ring. Mud tracked higher up among the rocks. A lantern wick still warm. So you weren't alone? No. Daniel's voice lost what little warmth it had held. Your father climbed the path to the ledge above the cove. There's a narrow shelf there, hidden by gorse and stone. We found a cavity in the cliff face. Artificial, not natural. Cut and reinforced years ago, then covered over. Someone had used it as a storage place. For what? At the time, we didn't know. It was mostly empty. Mostly? Daniel looked at her. There was a small iron box. Elena's pulse kicked. What was in it? He did not answer immediately. Daniel. A key, he said. An old brass key wrapped in oilcloth. And a strip of paper with a set of numbers. The coordinates. Not complete ones. But enough to matter. Elena tightened her grip on the letter. And then? We heard voices. The words settled coldly into the room. How many? At least 2. Perhaps 3. Men. Could you see them? Not well. Lantern light below. One boat in the inlet, maybe another farther out. Your father put the box inside his coat and told me we needed to leave. But you didn't. No. Why not? Daniel's mouth tightened. Because he wanted to know who they were. Elena closed her eyes for a brief second. Yes, she murmured. That sounds like him too. Daniel gave the smallest nod. He edged farther along the ledge to look down. I followed. The voices got louder. One of them said the hiding place had been disturbed. A fine chill spread across Elena's arms. They knew. Yes. What did you do? I told him we had to go. He wanted 1 more minute. And then? Daniel was silent long enough that she opened her eyes again. A muscle had jumped in his jaw. Then the rock gave way. She stared at him. What? The ledge had been damaged by weather. Maybe years of salt and frost. Maybe our weight. Maybe bad luck. His voice had become very controlled. One section broke beneath him. Elena's mind rejected the image before it fully formed. No. He fell about 10 feet onto the lower rocks. Not into the sea. I went after him. She took one step closer without realizing she had moved. Was he hurt? Yes. How badly? His shoulder, I think. Maybe ribs. He could stand, but not well. Then you got him out. Again that terrible pause. No, Daniel said. The word entered her like ice. She stared at him. No? Daniel's face had gone pale beneath the rain and lamp shadow. The men below heard the fall. They came up the path faster than I expected. Your father forced the box into my hands and told me to take the skiff and leave. Elena's throat tightened until her voice came out thin. And you did. He did not flinch from it. Yes. The room fell silent except for the wind. She had thought herself prepared for something terrible. But not this shape of it. Not a choice. Not abandonment. For several seconds she could only hear her own breathing. You left him there, she said at last. Yes. Her fingers opened and crushed the folded letter without her noticing. You left my father injured on a cliff in the dark while men were coming for him. Yes. The answer was not defensive. It was worse because it sounded like something he had already sentenced himself for many times. Elena's anger rose so fast it made her lightheaded. How dare you stand in this house and tell me you didn't betray him? Daniel's voice remained low. Because he ordered me to go. I don't care. I know. You should have stayed. Yes. You should have fought. Yes. You should have died there if you had to. For the first time, something sharp flashed in his expression, not anger, but pain, sudden and unguarded. It vanished almost immediately. Yes, he said again. The quietness of that answer nearly undid her. She wanted him to argue. To justify himself. To say he had no choice. Instead he stood there and accepted every accusation like a man who had spoken them all to himself in the dark for years. Elena turned away because she could not bear it. Rain traced the window in silver lines. Beyond it the sea was invisible now, only sound and darkness. What happened to him after that? Daniel's voice came from behind her. I don't know. She spun back around. No. It's the truth. You expect me to believe that? When I got back to the cove with help, the skiff was gone. The men were gone. Your father was gone. How long? Less than an hour. She shook her head. Then he was alive. I think so. You think so? Daniel swallowed once before answering. There was blood on the rocks. Not much. Signs of a struggle. And one of the men's lanterns smashed near the path. But no body. Elena's heart pounded painfully. Alive. Maybe. For 12 years, a maybe. She pressed a hand to the edge of the desk to steady herself. What did you do with the box? I hid it. Where? I'll show you tomorrow. Why not now? Because it's nearly 1 a.m, you're exhausted, and if I show you tonight, you'll insist on going out in the dark to confirm everything. Her mouth tightened. You say that like it's unreasonable. It would be unreasonable. She looked at him, angry all over again at the calm in his voice. And yet beneath it she could hear strain. Not fresh strain. Old strain pulled tight. What was in the box besides the key and numbers? A ring. She frowned. A ring? Daniel nodded. Gold. Set with a dark blue stone. It looked old. Possibly older than the ship itself. Elena thought of the woman in the folder. Isabel Mercer. Did it belong to her? Your father believed so. Why? There was an engraving inside. What did it say? Daniel hesitated only briefly. To I am. Until the tide returns. A shiver passed through Elena. It sounded like a vow and a warning at once. And the key, she said. What did it open? That, Daniel said, is one of the questions we never solved. The room fell quiet again. Elena became aware of the cold around her shoulders. In leaving her room so quickly, she had come downstairs wrapped only in the quilt. One edge had slipped, and she pulled it more tightly around herself. Daniel noticed. You should sit, he said. I'm fine. You're shivering. I said I'm fine. He moved toward the hearth in the small bedroom fireplace, more decorative than the one downstairs, but functional, and then stopped, perhaps realizing the intimacy of tending a fire in her room at this hour. Instead he crossed to the chair by the desk and drew it out. Elena almost refused. But her knees had begun to feel unreliable. She sat. Daniel remained standing, as if he did not trust himself to do the more comfortable thing. What happened after you went back with help? She asked. I told the constable there had been an accident on the cliffs. Not the truth? Not all of it. Why? Because your father had made enemies before that night. Because if I mentioned the box, it would vanish. Because the men we glimpsed in the cove would deny being there, and others would support them. He met her eyes. Because Greyhaven keeps its own stories until it's forced to surrender them. You sound like you hate this town. His gaze lowered for a moment. Some days I do. That answer lingered. She had expected loyalty. Or bitterness. Perhaps both. But not this weary honesty. What happened to the investigation? There barely was one. The storm came hard the next day. Someone found wreckage from your father's boat farther south. Enough to make the official version plausible. Elaborate. He kept a second vessel in the cove, Daniel said. Smaller, less noticeable. After the disappearance, pieces of it turned up on the reefs. Broken mast. Hull fragments. Convenient, Elena said. Yes. You think they wrecked it on purpose? I think someone wanted the sea to tell a simpler story. She looked down at the crushed letter in her hand. The paper crackled softly as she loosened her grip. And all these years you kept quiet. Yes. Even when you believed he might have survived. Yes. She waited for the reason. It came more quietly than everything else had. Because if he lived, Daniel said, then he stayed hidden for a reason. And if he died after that night, then anything I did had already failed him. The words settled heavily in the room. Elena did not answer immediately. There were things in his face now that had not been visible before, fatigue, certainly. Guilt. Something close to grief, though of a private and disciplined kind. She should have hated him cleanly. It would have been easier. Instead she could feel a more complicated pain beginning to form. Because what he had done was unforgivable. And because he seemed to know that better than anyone. She rose abruptly. I need air. It's still storming. I don't care. He moved slightly, not blocking the door, but enough that she saw the intention before he suppressed it. Elena. Don't. She stepped past him into the hallway. He followed, but at a distance that felt deliberate. Downstairs the house had grown colder. The study lamp still burned. The door remained locked. Her flashlight and the brass-handled walking stick lay where she had dropped them. She crossed to the front window instead and stood staring into the dark. Rain ran off the glass in shifting lines. The path outside was empty now. The garden bowed under the wind. You should sleep, Daniel said behind her. She laughed softly, without humor. That's a ridiculous suggestion. I know. But morning tends to make impossible things slightly more measurable. She turned. Do you always talk like that? Like what? Like you're trying to calm a frightened horse. To her surprise, his mouth curved faintly. Only when frightened horses seem likely to bolt off cliffs. The line should not have worked. And yet some exhausted part of her nearly smiled. That annoyed her more than anything. You said you'd show me the box tomorrow, she said. I will. And the cove? Yes. And the boathouse? Yes. She held his gaze. No more delay. None. The lamp between them threw a gentle light across his face, and for the first time she noticed how carefully he kept his body at rest. Not because he was naturally still, she thought, but because movement might betray too much. Tension. Weariness. Emotion. He was not a cold man. He was a contained one. That realization came with inconvenient force. It also made her remember, suddenly and absurdly, the way he had said her father spoke of her. The impossible questions. The sailcloth bed. Little details that could not have been invented. Her anger remained. But grief had begun to move through it now, altering its shape. You cared about him, she said quietly. Daniel looked down once, then back at her. Yes. The simple word filled the room. And he cared about you. A longer silence this time. I think so, Daniel said. You think so, she repeated, almost incredulous. He gave the smallest, saddest tilt of his head. He wasn't extravagant with affection. That was true enough that it took some strength from her anger. Her father had loved deeply but spoke of love like a man handling something delicate and dangerous. She turned back to the window. The worst of the storm was passing now. The rain had softened to a steadier, finer fall. The long violence of it was moving downshore. He left anyway, she murmured. Daniel did not answer, perhaps unsure whether the words were meant for him. Elena. He left years before he disappeared, she said, still looking outward. Not physically. Not at first. But he left piece by piece. He missed dinners. Forgot birthdays and then remembered them with gifts that were always slightly wrong. He would look at me and smile, and for a moment I'd have him back, and then something behind his eyes would pull away again. She swallowed. I was a child, but I noticed. The confession hovered between them. Behind her, the floorboards gave the faintest sound as Daniel shifted weight. I'm sorry, he said. She closed her eyes briefly. Don't say that like you can fix it. I know I can't. She turned again, more slowly this time. What if he chose all of this, she asked. Not just the work. Not the danger. What if he chose the mystery over me? Daniel's expression changed, not to pity but to something steadier. I don't think that's true. You don't know. No, he admitted. But I know this, whatever drove him was already in him long before Greyhaven. Men like your father don't stop loving the people who matter. They just become foolish enough to believe they can postpone the cost. The words struck with uncomfortable accuracy. She hated that he might understand her father that well. She hated that she believed him. The clock in the study gave a soft mechanical click before striking one. The sound moved through the house like a reminder that night would not pause for revelation. Daniel glanced toward the stairs. There's something else, he said. Elena's grip tightened on the letter again. Of course there is. I should show you. He went to the study, opened one of the desk drawers, and removed a small cloth bundle. When he returned, he unfolded it on the table beneath the lamp. Inside lay a fragment of metal, bent and darkened with age. At first Elena did not understand what she was looking at. Then she saw the shape. A charm. No bigger than a thumbnail. A tiny silver lighthouse. Her breath caught. She stared at it. I know that, she whispered. Daniel watched her face. Yes. It was on a chain. He nodded. She gave it to him. Your mother? Yes. The room tilted slightly with memory. Her mother laughing in the kitchen, fastening the chain around her father's neck because his hands were dirty with grease and varnish. It had broken years ago. Elena remembered helping him look for the missing charm, both of them on their knees under the workbench while her mother said from the doorway that some things preferred being lost. But it had not been lost. It had been here. Daniel spoke carefully. We found it on the ledge at Blackstone Cove the morning after. Elena did not touch it. If she did, she thought she might break. So he really was there. Yes. The truth of it entered her more deeply than the story had. Not abstract anymore. Not a vanished man told through records and explanations. A charm. A ledge. Blood on rock. Her father. She reached out at last and lifted the tiny lighthouse into her palm. It was colder than she expected. She closed her fingers around it. When were you going to show me this? She asked. Tomorrow. Another delay. Yes. This time she heard the self-disgust in his voice. For reasons she could not fully explain, that moved her more than any polished apology would have. She leaned against the edge of the table and looked down at her closed hand. The silver edges pressed into her skin. The house had fallen quieter now. Rain. Fire. The old clock. Daniel's breathing across from her. And in that softened silence, exhaustion finally took hold of her with full force. It arrived without dignity. One moment she was standing. The next she realized her vision had blurred at the edges and the table seemed farther away than it should. Daniel saw it instantly. Sit. This time she did not argue. He pulled out the chair and she lowered herself into it before her knees could fail her. She kept one hand wrapped around the lighthouse charm, the other still holding the letter. He poured water from a jug into a glass and set it in front of her. Drink. She obeyed, mostly because disobedience required more energy than she had. When she lowered the glass, he said quietly, "You don't have to understand everything tonight. That's convenient for you. It would be convenient for me if you slept for 6 hours and yelled at me in daylight instead." A tired sound escaped her. Not quite a laugh, not quite defeat. I might still do that. I'm counting on it. She looked up. His face, lit from one side by the lamp, seemed older in that moment. Not by years, but by vigilance. By holding too much too carefully. You really don't know who left that letter upstairs? She asked. No. But you know who could have. Yes. Tell me. He hesitated. There are 3 possibilities, he said. The first is someone trying to help you. The second is someone trying to frighten you away. And the third? That someone wants you to ask exactly the questions you're asking. She frowned. Why? Because the answers might lead you where they want. The cold returned. To the cove. Yes. Then we don't go. Daniel met her eyes. We go. She stared at him. You just said. I know what I said. But if someone is pushing us toward Blackstone Cove now, it means there's something there worth moving, hiding, or finding before we do. His voice remained calm, but urgency ran beneath it now. We go in daylight, on our terms. Elena looked down at the letter. The handwriting seemed almost elegant under the lamplight. A trap, perhaps. Or a warning. Or both. What if he's alive? She asked suddenly, the words leaving her before she could examine them. Daniel did not pretend not to understand who she meant. The room held very still. It's possible, he said. Not likely. Not probable. Possible. She closed her eyes. That single word was enough to keep hope breathing, which made it almost cruel. And if he is, she said, why didn't he come for me? Daniel did not answer at once. When he did, his voice was low. I don't know. She nodded, though the motion felt strange and detached. It was the one answer she trusted most. At last Daniel took a step back. You should try to rest, he said. I'll stay down here. No one comes in or out without my hearing it. You'll stay awake? Yes. That seems unwise. I've had practice. She considered arguing again, but the thought of the upstairs room no longer frightened her in the same way. Now the house felt watched from outside, not haunted from within. Wake me early, she said. I will. She rose carefully. At the foot of the stairs she stopped and looked back. Daniel had not moved far. He stood beside the lamp, hands braced lightly on the table, as if holding himself in place by intention alone. In the silence, something almost tender hovered and vanished before she could name it. Perhaps it was simply this: two people awake too late with the same ghost between them. Elena said, "If you lie to me again, I leave." He nodded. I know. And I mean it. I know. She searched his face for the slightest sign that he did not believe her. There was none. Upstairs, her room felt colder than before, though the storm had nearly passed. She locked the door again, though she was no longer sure whether locks mattered. She set the second letter on the desk. Then the tiny silver lighthouse charm beside it. For a long time she stood looking at both. Her name, written by an unseen hand. Her father's charm, found on the rocks. One new message. One old proof. She slipped into bed fully aware that sleep would not come easily. But fatigue was stronger now than fear. As she drifted near the edge of dreams, fragments of childhood returned more clearly than they had in years. A story told in darkness. A sea that took and gave back. A cove of black stone. And another memory, buried deeper than the rest, rose quietly at last. She was very small. Wrapped in a blanket. Half asleep on her father's shoulder. He was carrying her somewhere. Not home. There was salt in the air. A lamp swinging. The sound of waves close by and hidden from view. Her face turned against his coat, and she heard him murmur to someone in the dark. She won't remember this place. A man's voice answered, lower and younger than she expected. You can't know that. Then her father again, weary and certain at once. I need her not to. Elena opened her eyes in the darkness. The room around her was real again. The bed. The window. The old house breathing softly in the quiet after rain. But the memory remained. Not imagined. Not a dream. A remembered sentence. She won't remember this place. Her heart began to beat faster. A second voice. Lower. Younger. Could it have been? No. She sat up sharply. The room spun for a moment, then steadied. Downstairs, faint through the floorboards, she heard the old clock mark 1:30. Daniel was still awake below. She almost got out of bed. Almost ran downstairs and demanded whether he had been that second voice in her memory. But something stopped her. Not fear. Instinct. If the memory was real, if he had known her not just through stories but from some hidden corner of her childhood, then morning would bring more than answers. It would change the shape of everything. So she lay back slowly, staring at the ceiling while pale storm light moved across it in shifting patterns. At last sleep came. Uneven. Light. Filled with cliffs, lanterns, and a cove of black stone. And just before morning, she dreamed of a woman standing at the edge of the sea in an old dark coat, one hand raised as if in farewell. When Elena tried to call to her, the woman turned. But before her face could be seen, the tide rose between them. Morning arrived too gently for the kind of night it followed. Elena woke to a pale wash of silver light and the faint cry of gulls somewhere outside. For several seconds she did not remember where she was. Then she saw the unfamiliar desk beneath the window, the folded letter on it, and the silver lighthouse charm catching the morning light. Greyhaven. Daniel. Blackstone Cove. Her father. She sat up, heart already tight with everything waiting beyond the door. The storm had passed completely. Sunlight had not yet broken through, but the world outside had the luminous, rinsed look of a coast after rain. She dressed quickly, washed in cold water that made her fully awake, and brushed out her hair with impatient strokes. When she lifted the second letter again, she noticed something she had missed in the dark. A faint smell. Not perfume. Not sea salt. Smoke. Wood smoke, but sweeter than the cedar that burned downstairs. She frowned. Then tucked the note into her coat pocket and slipped the lighthouse charm beside it. When she opened the bedroom door, the hallway was empty. No sound came from downstairs. A new unease touched her. She went down quickly. The front room stood quiet in the dim gray morning. The fire had burned low to ash. One mug sat on the table. Another, untouched, waited beside a plate of bread and sliced pear. Prepared for her. But Daniel was nowhere in sight. "Elena," came his voice from outside. She turned toward the open back door. He stood in the garden, sleeves rolled, a coil of rope over one shoulder and a canvas satchel at his feet. In daylight he looked different. Less haunted, perhaps. Or merely less shadowed. The severity of his face softened in morning light, though the tiredness remained. "You're up," he said. "You sound surprised." "I'm not. I'm impressed." She stepped out onto the stone threshold. The air smelled washed and cold and green. Beyond the garden wall the sea shone dull silver under a clearing sky. "Where have you been?" "Checking the path to the cove." He nodded toward the satchel. "And making sure we have what we need." "You were going without me?" His brows lifted. "In this?" He glanced pointedly at her coatless state. Elena looked down at herself, realized she was still in house slippers, and nearly laughed despite everything. "That's not the point." "No," he said. "It isn't." His expression sobered. "I wasn't leaving without you." The words were simple. Something in them landed strangely. Trust was far away still, if it would ever come. But some quieter thread had begun to pull between them, unwanted and undeniable. Elena folded her arms against the morning chill. "I remembered something last night." Daniel became very still. "What?" "A voice," she said. "My father carrying me somewhere by the sea." He said, "She won't remember this place." Another man answered him. Daniel said nothing. Her gaze sharpened. "Was it you?" For one suspended moment she thought he might deny it. Instead he looked at her with a steadiness that felt almost like surrender. "Yes," he said. The morning air seemed to thin. "You knew me before." "Yes." "How old was I?" 5. Perhaps just turned 6. "And you never mentioned that." "No." "Why?" He glanced toward the sea, then back at her. "Because once I said it aloud, you would ask why your father brought you here. And I didn't know how to answer without telling you everything else." She felt anger rise again, but beneath it came something even more unsettling. Recognition. Not of memory exactly, but of him. Some tiny echo in the shape of his voice, the stillness of him, the sense that she had once looked up at this man from a child's height and trusted the world because her father stood beside him. It was absurd. And it shook her more than the letters had. "Did I know you?" she asked. "A little." "What does that mean?" He gave the smallest shadow of a smile. "You thought my name was too serious." Elena stared. Against her will, another fragment stirred in the dark cupboard of memory, a younger voice, her own, stubborn and sleepy. "Daniel sounds like someone who folds maps for fun." She blinked. The memory vanished again before she could catch it fully. Daniel saw something change in her face. "Yes," he said quietly. "That was you." She turned away, overwhelmed by the sudden closeness of something she had believed entirely lost. The garden grass glittered with rain. Somewhere down the slope, waves moved in long silver lines beneath the cliffs. "When were we here?" she asked. "Summer," Daniel said. "Years before the night at Blackstone Cove." Your father came for 3 days. He brought you because he had no one else to leave you with, and because he believed the visit would be harmless. But it wasn't. No. She looked back at him sharply. Why? He hesitated. Because that was when he first found the hidden path. To the cove? Yes. The morning, which had seemed almost gentle a moment before, changed shape around her. She had been here. Not by accident. Not in some unrelated childhood blur. Connected to it from the start. All right, she said. Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. Show me everything. Daniel studied her for one brief moment, as if measuring whether she truly meant it. Then he nodded. Eat first. She almost protested. Then her stomach betrayed her with an audible hollow ache. Daniel, very politely, did not comment. He simply lifted the satchel and carried it inside. Elena followed, the silver lighthouse in her pocket and the second letter folded against her heart like a warning she was no longer willing to ignore. And somewhere beyond the quiet house and the rinsed morning sea, Blackstone Cove waited. With answers. Or another trap. Or both. But by now Elena suspected that in Greyhaven, those two things had always been closer than anyone wanted to admit. Chapter 4, The Cove at Low Tide. Breakfast was quiet. Not tense in the obvious way. Not brittle. Something stranger than that. The night had broken open too many sealed rooms between them for ordinary conversation to survive unchanged. Every simple movement seemed to carry a second meaning now. Daniel slicing bread. Elena pouring tea. The scrape of a chair over old floorboards. The soft tap of a spoon against ceramic. The small domestic sounds felt out of place beside the story of hidden coves, missing coordinates, and men moving through storm-dark cliffs. Elena sat at the table nearest the window and forced herself to eat. A slice of bread with butter. Half a pear. Tea strong enough to clear the last weakness of broken sleep from her head. Outside, the world looked almost deceptively peaceful. The storm had washed the sky into wide-moving bands of silver and pale blue. Sunlight struggled through in narrow shafts, touching the sea here and there until the water flashed like metal. Gulls circled above the cliffs. Wet grass bent in the wind. If she had arrived in Greyhaven on a morning like this instead of under storm clouds, she might have thought the town beautiful first and uneasy second. Daniel stood at the counter wrapping a small parcel in cloth. What's that? She asked. Food. We're going to a cove, not on an expedition. He glanced over his shoulder. I've learned not to trust your estimates. My estimates? You said last night you'd need air. You nearly marched into a gale wrapped in a quilt. Despite herself, Elena gave him a cool look that was only partially real. That was a special circumstance. I'm sure. He tied the parcel with string and placed it in the satchel beside a coil of rope, a water flask, and a folded oilskin. Everything about him this morning was efficient, almost understatedly careful. He had changed into a heavier navy sweater and dark trousers tucked into weathered boots. His hair, still slightly damp from the early sea air, curled faintly at the temples. Elena disliked noticing such details. Or rather, she disliked the quiet awareness that made her notice them at all. She set down her cup. I'm ready. You need a better coat. I have one. You have a city coat. It's wool. It will be useless on the cliff path if the wind turns. She opened her mouth to argue, but he was already crossing to a narrow closet near the back door. He returned with a dark oilskin jacket and held it out. It was my aunt's, he said. Too large for you, but warm. Elena looked at it. I'm not wearing your aunt's coat to chase old secrets down a smuggler's path. Daniel did not lower the jacket. You'll wear it because the path is narrow, the rocks will still be slick from last night's rain, and there is no practical advantage to being stubborn and cold at the same time. She stared at him for 2 seconds. Then took the coat. It's temporary. Of course. The faintest hint of amusement touched his voice. She should have found it irritating. Instead it steadied something in her, though she would never have admitted that aloud. The coat smelled faintly of dried herbs and wood smoke. The sleeves were indeed too long, and she had to fold them back once. But it was warm, and the weight of it made her feel unexpectedly anchored. Daniel picked up the satchel and keys from the table. At the door, Elena paused. The second letter was still in her pocket. Her father's silver lighthouse charm rested beside it. She pressed her fingers briefly against the outline of both. Then followed Daniel out into the morning. The path to Blackstone Cove did not begin where she expected. Elena had imagined some hidden trail branching from the cliff road, dramatic and obvious in retrospect. Instead, Daniel led her first down through the town. Greyhaven in daylight was more inhabited than it had seemed on her arrival, though still quieter than most places of its size. The harbor road curved close to the water, bordered by old stone buildings painted in weather-softened colors, white, blue, pale green, many with shutters and narrow signs swinging overhead. A bakery exhaled the smell of warm bread into the cold air. Two fishermen stood outside a chandlery smoking in silence. A woman sweeping the front steps of a guest house looked up as Elena and Daniel passed, her gaze lingering a fraction too long. Elena noticed. So did Daniel. Do they all know me already? She asked under her breath. In a town this size, he said. By now, probably. Because I arrived with a suitcase in a storm. And because strangers are visible here. That's one way to describe it. He glanced at her. Would you prefer gently surveilled? The corner of her mouth almost moved. Almost. They continued past the harbor, where fishing boats rocked in the pale sunlight. Ropes creaked. Nets hung drying like rough gray curtains. Somewhere metal clanged rhythmically against metal. Elena breathed in the salt air and tried not to imagine her father on these docks years ago, asking careful questions with that patient, absent smile of his. They left the center of town by a lane that curved between two stone walls overgrown with ivy and winter-thinned rose canes. At the far end stood a small church facing the sea. Its graveyard tilted gently toward the cliffs, white and gray stones crowded together under the wind. Daniel slowed but did not stop. Elena looked through the iron fence as they passed. Is there a grave for him? She asked quietly. Yes. Her steps faltered. There's a marker, Daniel corrected, hearing what she had not said aloud. No body. She kept walking. For a moment the path, the sea, the entire morning narrowed to that simple fact. A grave with no body. A place to mourn what had never been proven. Did you go? She asked. To the service? Yes. A pause. Yes. She did not know what to do with that answer, so she let it pass. Beyond the church, the lane ended at a broad field of wet grass enclosed by broken fencing. Sheep grazed there, their wool dirted by winter. From this height Elena could see much more of the coast, a series of headlands and dark rock shelves rising and falling in long weathered lines. Daniel turned inland for a short distance, following what looked like no path at all. Are you certain you know where we're going? She asked. Usually. Usually. He looked back. That was a joke. It needs work. He nodded as if accepting a fair criticism. I'll revise it. That nearly made her laugh. It alarmed her enough that she looked away quickly. After a few more minutes, the grass gave way to lower brush and bent gorse. A wall of blackthorn and bramble grew thick along the cliff edge, seemingly impassable. Daniel stopped beside a leaning stone marker almost hidden by moss. This is where your father found it, he said. The path. Yes. Elena looked doubtful. There's nothing here. That was the point. He passed the satchel to her and stepped into the thorn scrub, using both hands to part branches that at first seemed tangled at random. Beneath them, gradually, a narrow opening appeared, little more than a dark seam in the undergrowth. A hidden way. Elena felt a strange tightening in her chest. This, then, was part of what her father had found while she was still a child. Daniel held the branches back. Mind the thorns. She ducked through. On the other side, the ground dropped sharply. A thin path cut into the cliff face, wound downward in a series of rough turns. It was half natural, half worked by hand long ago, with sections of old stone steps built into the slope and others no more than packed earth and exposed roots. The sea opened beside them, immense and cold and glittering. Elena looked down once and wished she hadn't. Far below, waves foamed around black rock in white seams and restless circles. "It's steep," she said. "Yes. You might have led with that. I did mention the better coat." He took back the satchel and started down first, testing each section before putting full weight on it. Elena followed carefully. The wind was stronger here, pressing her clothes back against her body. The oilskin flapped at her calves. She kept one hand to the cliff wall, damp with moss and salt, and watched her steps. For the first few minutes neither of them spoke. The path required too much attention. But silence with another person was not always empty. She became aware of Daniel's way of moving, not hurried, but decisive. He glanced back often enough to judge whether she was steady without making a visible fuss over her. Twice he offered a hand. The first time she ignored it. The second time, on a section of crumbling shale that shifted under her boot, she accepted before pride could intervene. His grip was warm and firm and brief. He let go as soon as she found balance. Still, the impression of it remained. Annoyingly. The descent opened at last into a narrow shelf between cliff and sea. Blackstone Cove. It was smaller than she had imagined, and more secret. The inlet curved inward like a hidden mouth in the coastline, shielded on both sides by dark stone walls veined with quartz. At low tide a sweep of black rock lay exposed, slick and shining beneath shallow pools that mirrored the sky. Seaweed trailed in long green-brown ribbons. A rusted iron ring had been fixed deep into one of the lower rocks, nearly invisible until Daniel pointed to it. "There," he said. "The mooring ring." "Yes." Elena looked around. No one was there. No boats. No lanterns. Only gulls wheeling above, the wind moving through grass higher on the cliffs, and the slow inward breathing of the tide. The cove held sound strangely. Every wave seemed to arrive from farther away than it should, then strike closer than expected. "It feels hidden," she said quietly. "That's why it mattered." Daniel moved toward the inner curve of the cove, picking his way over wet stone. Elena followed more slowly. At one end, beneath an overhang in the cliff, the rocks narrowed into a dark recess barely visible from a distance. Water dripped steadily there from moss and fern. This, she understood, must be the beginning of the path to the ledge above. Daniel set down the satchel. "This way is where we climbed that night." Elena looked up. The route was narrow and ugly with risk. A scramble rather than a proper path. Stone ledges, jutting roots, rough footholds shaped more by necessity than design. "You expect me to go up there. I expect you to decide whether you want the truth enough to tolerate bad footing." She gave him a flat look. "That is not the persuasive line you think it is." A flicker of softness crossed his face. "Take your time." He climbed first, then turned to guide her from above through the worst section. She hated how much easier it was to follow his instructions than to invent her own. "Left foot there," he said. "That doesn't look stable." "It isn't, but the root above it is." "That is not reassuring." "Use the root anyway." At one point the rock sloped unexpectedly, and Elena's boot slipped on wet lichen. She made a small involuntary sound and pitched forward. Daniel caught her at once. One arm around her waist. One hand braced against the cliff behind her. For a second neither of them moved. She could feel the force of his breath from the climb, the warmth of him beneath the cold air, the sudden terrible awareness of how close another body could be when there was nowhere else to fall. His eyes met hers. Gray, clear, intent. "You're all right," he said quietly. The words were practical. But the tone was not entirely. Elena felt heat rise unexpectedly under her skin, which was absurd given the wind and the cliff and the fact that she still had every reason in the world not to trust him. She stepped back as soon as she could. "Yes," she said. "I know." Daniel lowered his hand immediately and turned away first. That, somehow, made the moment sharper rather than easier. They continued upward. At the top, the ledge revealed itself not as a dramatic platform but as a narrow shelf tucked behind a curtain of scrub and rock. Hidden from below. Hidden from above unless you knew where to look. The cliff face behind it had been cut in one place. Daniel crouched there and brushed aside dead leaves and loose grit. A recess, carefully shaped by tools long ago, opened beneath the stone. Elena knelt beside him. "This is where the box was." "Yes." She touched the inner wall of the cavity. It was dry despite the damp air. Protected. Whoever made this knew it would stay hidden. Daniel nodded. And knew how to work coastal rock. She glanced toward the mouth of the cove below. Smugglers. Or people with smugglers' habits. She looked back into the recess. It was empty now. No key. No ring. No strip of paper. Only absence. How many people knew about this place? Very few, Daniel said. Your father. Me. Possibly the men who came that night. Perhaps whoever sent the letters. And someone much older than all of us, long dead, who first used it. Elena sat back on her heels. The sea stretched beyond the opening in shards of silver. Show me where he fell. Daniel was still for a moment. Then rose. He led her 3 careful steps farther along the ledge to a place where the stone changed color, lighter, rougher, fractured. One edge dropped sharply to the lower rocks below. This section broke, he said. Elena looked down. The drop was not fatal by itself, but bad enough. She could imagine it too clearly, the wet stone, a foot placed 1 inch wrong, the crack, the fall. There was no blood now, of course. Only lichen, gull droppings, weather. Yet the place seemed to hold an imprint of violence all the same. She knelt again and studied the lower rocks. Can we get down there? Yes, from the cove. They returned more slowly, Elena more thoughtful now than frightened. Once back on the black rock shelf below, Daniel crossed to a cluster of stone near the base of the ledge. He pointed to a broad flat surface darkened by tide and time. Here, he said. The word was soft. Elena stood beside him and looked. Nothing visible remained. No stain. No break. But she felt it anyway, a strange pressure behind her ribs, as if memory could exist in matter. She slipped a hand into her pocket and closed it around the silver lighthouse charm. Were you the one who found it? She asked. Yes. Right here? Near the edge of that crack. He pointed to a narrow seam between 2 rocks. It had caught there. Elena imagined him kneeling in the dawn after the storm, fingers wet with sea spray, seeing the charm and knowing instantly whose it was. The image hurt more than she expected. Did you tell anyone? No. Why? Because it proved he had been here. And at the time, proving that to the wrong people felt dangerous. She looked at him sharply. The wrong people. Meaning the Mercers? Perhaps. Or someone tied to them. Or someone tied to the cove but not the family. That sounds deliberately vague. It is also accurate. She exhaled and looked out to sea. The wind lifted loose strands of her hair across her face. She brushed them away impatiently. Could the men have taken him by boat, she asked. Yes. Could he have escaped them? Yes. Could he have hidden? Yes. The repeated answer began to feel like a cruel rhythm. Could he have died anyway? Daniel did not speak immediately. At last he said, "Yes." The honesty in it made her close her eyes briefly. When she opened them, she noticed something half hidden beyond a low jut of rock near the inward curve of the cove. A weathered timber, almost black with age, protruded from a collapse of stones and seaweed. "What is that?" Daniel followed her gaze. "Part of an old landing shelf," he said. "Or what remains of one." Elena moved toward it, picking her way between slick pools. Up close she could see more, iron spikes driven into rock, fragments of rotted planking lodged where storms had tossed them but never fully carried them away. This was built. Yes. For smuggling? Likely. She crouched and brushed sand from one of the iron spikes. It had been here a very long time. And no one in town talks about this. Daniel gave her a look. "Oh, they talk. They simply do it indirectly, in lowered voices, and only after denying knowledge for at least 20 minutes. That time she did smile. A small one. It vanished quickly, but he saw it. Something gentled in his expression in return. Elena straightened and turned toward the higher cliff wall. Where would they store things if the recess above wasn't enough? Daniel set down the satchel and scanned the rock face. Possibly nowhere permanent. Small drops only. Enough to pass between boat and land. But if there was a ring, a key, numbers, something more valuable, she looked slowly around the cove again. There has to be another hiding place. Daniel regarded her for a beat, then nodded once. "That," he said, "is precisely what your father said." She almost answered, but something in the stones near the waterline caught her eye. At first she thought it was another tide pool reflecting sky. Then she realized it was glass. A bottleneck, broken and trapped between rocks. She crouched and tugged it free. Not modern. Thick glass, dark green, rough with age. What about this? Daniel stepped closer. Old. Could be from any period. It was wedged deliberately. He took it from her and turned it in the light. The base had been corked at some point, though no cork remained now. He frowned. Then looked up. "Help me with these." Together they shifted 2 smaller stones beside where the bottle had been. Beneath them lay a shallow hollow protected from the tide by the angle of the rock. Empty now. But not naturally so. Daniel's expression changed. "This has been used recently." "How can you tell?" He pointed. At the back of the hollow, shielded from seawater, the stone was dry and lightly scratched. Something rectangular had been stored there. Not long ago. Elena's pulse rose. So whoever sent the letter was right. Something happened here. Or wanted us to know something happened here. She stood and turned slowly in a full circle, scanning the cove, the ledge above, the path down. No one. Nothing. And yet she had the distinct sensation that they were standing in the center of a conversation already in progress. "What size?" she asked. Daniel measured roughly with his hands. "A box perhaps. Or packet wrapped in oilcloth." "The key?" "Maybe." "The missing notebook pages?" "Maybe." She looked up toward the cliff top. "Then we're late." "Possibly." The wind shifted. A gull cried sharply overhead. And then, from somewhere above them on the hidden path, came the unmistakable sound of stones skidding under a boot. Both of them froze. Daniel looked up instantly. Someone was on the cliff above. A shadow moved briefly between the scrub at the path opening. Then disappeared. Daniel grabbed the satchel. "Stay close." He was already moving toward the climb. Elena followed at once. "This is absurd," she hissed. "How are there always people on cliffs? I'll draft a complaint for the geography." They climbed fast now, caution reduced to necessity. Daniel moved ahead, then reached back for her whenever the footing narrowed. Elena took his hand each time without argument. Adrenaline had stripped pride down to essentials. By the time they reached the hidden opening through the thorn scrub, no one was visible. The field beyond lay open and empty under the pale sky. Grass moved in long waves. A crow lifted from the broken fence post and flew inland. Daniel stepped out first, scanning the ground. "Did you see who it was?" Elena whispered. "No." "Man or woman?" "Too brief to tell." He crouched near the opening. The ground there was soft from rain, though not soft enough for a clear print. Still, one mark remained where the heel had cut deeper into the earth. Wide. Heavy. "A boot," he said. "Helpful." "Not yours." "Not mine." She crossed her arms tightly. "I assumed as much." Daniel looked toward the church lane in the distance, then toward the farther ridge where the cliff track vanished behind gorse. Whoever it was, they knew the hidden path. Or followed us. Yes. Which is worse? He stood. At the moment? Equal. Elena took the second letter from her pocket and unfolded it. "Ask Daniel what really happened at Blackstone Cove." She stared at the words with new irritation. "This was never about asking," she said. "It was about making sure we came back." Daniel looked at the note but did not reach for it. "Yes. Then someone expected us to find the hollow. Or wanted to see whether we would." The unease that had hovered around the cove deepened. "You think we're being watched?" "I think we have been for longer than either of us likes." They began walking away from the hidden path, not hurrying but not dawdling. Open ground felt safer than the enclosed slope above the cove. The church bell rang once in the distance. It was only a quarter hour, perhaps for some old parish custom, yet the sound rolled across the field with a lonely solemnity that made Elena glance instinctively toward the graveyard. "Take me there," she said. Daniel turned. "Where?" "To my father's marker." He studied her face and saw, she knew, that the request was not impulsive. "Now?" "Yes." He hesitated only briefly. "All right." The graveyard stood on a slope above the sea, enclosed by a low stone wall furred with moss. The gate complained softly when Daniel pushed it open. Inside, the wind was quieter. The stones themselves seemed to interrupt it, rows and rows of names and dates leaning at uncertain angles in the grass. Some graves were neat and recently tended. Others had sunk with time, their inscriptions softened almost to nothing. Elena walked between them slowly. Daniel did not lead her immediately. He stayed a little behind, allowing her the illusion, or perhaps the dignity, of arriving on her own. Then she saw it. A modest stone near the outer wall, where the sea could be seen beyond in a gray-blue line. Jonas Marin. Beloved father. Lost at sea. November 14, 2013. Elena stopped. The date. She had not thought of the date in years without feeling herself become two people at once, the child who had believed adults when they said lost, and the older self who understood how often that word was chosen because no one wanted to say never found. She stepped closer. Someone had placed fresh white flowers there. Not many. Just a small bundle tied with twine. She turned sharply toward Daniel. "I didn't do that," he said at once. "I didn't say you did." "But you thought it." She looked back at the flowers. Not market flowers. Wild ones, perhaps gathered from hedgerow and cliff edge. Early bloom. Delicate, stubborn. "Who comes here?" she asked quietly. "I don't know." That's becoming a very repetitive answer. It's still true. She crouched beside the stone. The grass was damp against her knees through the borrowed coat. She reached out and traced her father's name with 2 fingers. Jonas Marin. The letters felt colder than the silver charm had. "He hated ceremony," she said after a moment. Daniel's voice came softly from behind her. "Yes. If he knew there was a marker, he'd probably complain it was too dramatic." A pause. Then, unexpectedly, Daniel said he'd complained the wording was lazy. Despite the ache in her chest, a quiet laugh escaped her. Yes, she said. He would. The grief that rose with it was gentler than the kind she had known before. Not because it hurt less, but because it now had edges, places, objects. A ledge. A cove. A charm. A hidden path. A stone with no body beneath it. She did not know whether that was mercy or cruelty. Maybe both. She stood and brushed wet grass from her skirt. Who paid for this marker? Daniel answered at once. I did. She looked at him. The wind moved his hair across his forehead. He did not look away. I couldn't leave it empty, he said. The words were simple. Elena had prepared herself for many kinds of answers in Greyhaven, evasions, half-truths, old lies wrapped in concern. Not that. For a long moment, she could not speak. The knowledge settled slowly, almost physically. He had not only attended the service. He had stood somewhere inside the aftermath of her father's disappearance and chosen, quietly, to give him a place. A place for grief. A place for memory. Even if it was false in one sense and unfinished in another. You had no right, she said at last. Daniel inclined his head. Probably not. But you did it anyway. Yes. Why? He looked at the stone rather than at her. Because there should have been somewhere for him to be loved. Elena felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. She turned away before the expression on her face could become something she did not want him to see. The sea beyond the wall gleamed under a break in the clouds, bright enough to hurt the eyes. After a moment, Daniel said, There's one more place we should go before town notices we're wandering around graveyards together. She faced him again. What place? The boathouse. The eastern ridge lay beyond the harbor, on the opposite side of town. They walked part of the way in silence. Not because there was nothing to say, but because too much had already been said and not yet absorbed. Greyhaven seemed busier now as noon approached. A produce truck rattled over the cobbles. Two children chased each other along the quay in bright sweaters while a dog barked at gulls overhead. From an upstairs window someone shook out a rug and sent dust into the light. Elena became aware of glances following them. Some curious. Some indifferent. One or two more guarded than either. At the corner near the post office, a tall man in a dark cap stood beside a parked delivery van, smoking. He watched Daniel with the flat, unreadable expression of someone measuring an old acquaintance. Daniel saw him and kept walking. Elena lowered her voice. Friend of yours? No. Enemy? Possibly rented. She looked at him sharply. That was not a joke. No. Before she could ask more, the man turned away and flicked his cigarette into the gutter. Daniel's pace did not change. Who was that? Martin Hales. He does odd jobs for the Mercer properties. Repairs, transport, whatever earns cash without questions. And he was watching us. Yes. Why? Likely because news of your arrival traveled faster than breakfast. They turned onto a narrower road lined with salt-bent trees. The houses thinned and then disappeared. Ahead, the land opened into rough grass and scrub descending toward a smaller private inlet. At its edge stood the boathouse. It was built low and long from weathered timber, the roof patched in two places with newer slate. One side leaned slightly toward the sea, as if years of wind had persuaded it into a permanent listening posture. The tide here had risen enough to lick against the slipway stones below the open water door. Elena stopped. Something in her recognized it before thought did. Not clearly. Not enough to call it memory. But enough to make her skin tighten with a feeling almost like homesickness for somewhere she had never consciously known. You've been here, Daniel said quietly. She looked at him. Yes. He nodded toward the building. Your father brought you that summer. The air seemed to shift around her. No wonder it felt familiar. Daniel unlocked the side door and let her enter first. Inside, the boathouse smelled of damp wood, old rope, and faint engine oil. Dust floated in the narrow shafts of light that slipped through gaps in the boards. A workbench lined one wall, scarred by years of use. Rusted hooks held coils of rope and fishing nets long stiff with salt. At the back stood a chart cabinet with one drawer broken open. The damage was recent. Pride. Whoever broke in knew where to look, Elena said. Yes. She moved slowly through the space, fingertips brushing the edge of the bench, the rough grain of the walls. Little sensations sparked and vanished, childhood impressions too incomplete to hold. A high stool. A red tin box. Her father laughing because she wanted to sit in a boat on land and call it sailing. Daniel watched her without interrupting. At last she turned toward the cabinet. Was this where he kept the pages? Some of them. And the rest? Daniel crossed to the far wall where an old rack of oars hung above a chest. He removed two of the oars, then pressed his hand flat against one section of timber. A panel shifted inward. Hidden storage. Elena stared. Of course, she murmured. Daniel opened the compartment. It was shallow, lined with tarred cloth, and almost empty. Almost. Inside lay a single folded chart, a tin waterproof case, and a key of blackened iron unlike the brass key from Blackstone Cove. You left those here? I left the chart. The case was moved from the house after the break-in. The iron key, he glanced at it. I found that here years ago. Not with the box. Hidden separately. Elena picked up the key. It was heavy, old, and cold in her hand. This opens what? If I knew, I would have told you. She lifted a brow. Would you? His expression said, fair. She opened the tin case. Inside were two things. A faded photograph. And a piece of paper covered in her father's handwriting. Her breath caught. The photograph showed three people standing in front of the boathouse. The image had aged into brown and silver, but the faces were still visible. Her father, younger and leaner, one hand resting on a child's shoulder. Elena. Small, serious, squinting into the sun. And beside them, Daniel. Younger by years, but unmistakably Daniel. Dark-haired, unsmiling, trying and failing not to look uncomfortable in front of the camera. Elena stared at the image. A memory fluttered open with sudden clarity. She was standing on a crate so she can see over the top of the workbench. Her father is telling the other man, young, quiet, impossible not to notice because he speaks only when necessary, that a photograph will not kill him. And the young man says that remains unproven. Elena looked up slowly. Daniel was watching her face in a way that told her he knew exactly what memory had just returned. You remembered, he said. It was not a question. A little. She looked back at the photograph. You were there. Yes. All this time. Yes. The words were becoming a kind of tide between them. Not enough. But constant. She set the photograph down very carefully and opened the folded paper. The handwriting was her father's. Not a diary page. A note. Shorter than she wanted. Longer than she could bear. D. If the pattern holds, the cove is not the destination. Only the exchange point. The old families are guarding the wrong secret, or pretending to. If I fail to return by dawn, burn the red ledger and keep Elena away from Greyhaven until you know which story survived me. J. Elena read it twice. Then a third time. Her eyes snagged on the same phrase each time. The old families are guarding the wrong secret, or pretending to. She lowered the paper slowly. What red ledger? Daniel looked genuinely grim now. That, he said, is exactly what I've never found. And in the silence that followed, Elena understood that whatever had begun with a shipwreck, a vanished woman, and a hidden cove had shifted again. There was another secret. A wrong one. Or a false one placed over the real thing like a veil. And her father had known it just before he disappeared. She looked from the note to the broken chart cabinet, to the hidden compartment, to the old photograph of herself standing between two men who had tried to keep this place from her and failed. Then she folded the note with careful hands. "What survived him?" she asked quietly. Daniel did not answer at once. But when he finally spoke, his voice had changed. Not softer. More dangerous. "I think," he said, "we're about to find out." Chapter 5, The Red Ledger. For the rest of the afternoon, Elena felt as though the world had been built in layers and someone had suddenly begun stripping them away one by one. The boathouse no longer seemed like an old shelter by the sea. It was evidence. The photograph on the workbench. The hidden compartment. The broken chart drawer. Her father's note folded now inside her coat pocket beside the silver lighthouse charm and the second letter. Each object had weight. Not just physical weight, though she felt that too. The heavier pressure was inward. A sense that every answer uncovered another concealed door. Daniel closed the hidden panel in the wall and replaced the oars over it. "You memorized all of this," Elena said. He glanced at her. "Most of it. You keep saying you don't know things, and then you reveal hidden rooms and walls. It's a shallow compartment, not a hidden room. That is a very poor defense." A faint breath of amusement passed through him. Noted. He took the chart from the compartment and spread it on the workbench. The paper had yellowed and curled at the edges. It was a coastal map of Greyhaven and the surrounding waters, but marked over in her father's hand with circles, arrows, and small coded notations. Some of the symbols meant nothing to her. Others she recognized from the notebook. Small stars for witnessed lights, slashes for unreliable testimony, triangles for altered records. Her father had always made systems when he worked. Systems inside systems. A map of what he knew and what he doubted, always separate, always precise. Elena leaned over the chart. "This is the same pattern you mentioned." "Yes." Daniel touched a line drawn between Blackstone Cove and a point farther south along the reef. He believed the cove was a transfer point, he said. A place where items came ashore temporarily. Not the final hiding place. And the final place is here? Possibly. Elena frowned. That's in open water. Not entirely. There's a reef shelf under it. At very low tide, a narrow rock line surfaces. Dangerous, but navigable if you know the channel. She studied the mark. The Orpheline sank there? Or near enough. But your father wrote that the old families were guarding the wrong secret, or pretending to. She tapped the note in her pocket. That suggests the wreck itself wasn't the real goal. Daniel nodded slowly. Yes. Then what was? He was quiet for a moment. I've had 3 working theories over the years, he said. 1. The ship was used to carry something hidden, and the wreck became the story everyone focused on because it was dramatic and useful. 2. The cove and the reef were part of a longer smuggling route unrelated to the wreck at first, then attached to it later when the disappearance of the ship made an excellent cover. 3. He stopped. 3 what? Daniel's gaze moved from the chart to the window, where pale light glanced off the water outside. 3, he said at last, your father found evidence that something was hidden on land, not at sea, and the wreck was only ever misdirection. Elena let that settle. The boathouse creaked softly around them. Outside, the tide moved under the slipway in low sucking sounds against the stone. Which theory do you believe now? He looked back at the map. Today? I'm less certain than yesterday. That's encouraging. It shouldn't be. Certainty is usually what gets people hurt. Elena folded her arms. She was beginning to understand that much about him. He distrusted easy conclusions the way some people distrusted strangers. It made him hard to pin down. It also made his silences more meaningful than most people's speeches. Her gaze dropped again to the chart. One section near the lower right corner had been marked, erased, and marked again. The paper there was rubbed almost thin. What about this? Daniel followed her finger. That's old Mercer land. She looked up. Specific. There was once a house there. Then a storage building. Then nothing visible after a cliff fall in the 1950s. The title passed quietly between branches of the family until it ended up folded into broader coastal holdings. And my father noticed. Yes. Did he go there? Daniel hesitated. Daniel. Yes, he said. At least twice that I know of. What did he find? Nothing, he told me directly. Her patience frayed. That phrase again. He met her irritation evenly. You think I enjoy saying it? No. I think you're practiced at it. For the first time since entering the boathouse, something flashed in his expression that looked very close to anger. Not at her. At the truth of what she had said. You're right, he said. I am. The words came flat and controlled. A small silence followed. Then Elena exhaled and looked down again. They were both tired. Hungry again, probably. Strung too tight by the morning. She had no desire to waste energy on the shape of his guilt when there were still facts to gather. Tell me about the red ledger. Daniel leaned one hip against the workbench, arms folded loosely, eyes on the chart. I never saw it. But he mentions it. Yes. And instructs you to burn it if he doesn't return by dawn. Yes. So either he trusted you with that task, or he thought you knew where it was. He may have thought both. That's not useful. It's what I have. Elena stared at the note in her mind. Burn the red ledger and keep Elena away from Greyhaven until you know which story survived me. The phrasing disturbed her more each time. Not if a story survived. Which story? As if he expected competing versions of events, she murmured. Daniel nodded. I've thought that for years. 2 stories. At least 2. The official one, Elena said slowly. Boat lost in a storm. And the one his enemies wanted. She looked at him. What would that be? He did not answer immediately. That he was a thief, Daniel said at last. Or unstable. Or meddling in things beyond his understanding. Something to discredit whatever he had learned if it surfaced after him. Elena felt anger stir again, this time on behalf of a dead or vanished man who could no longer defend himself. That's convenient. Yes. And the true story? Daniel's gaze held hers. That is what he was trying to preserve. The boathouse seemed to shrink around those words. Elena turned away and walked toward the open water door, where the afternoon shone in broad cold strokes across the inlet. She stood there looking out at the sea. In daylight the water seemed almost innocent. As if it had never swallowed names, wreckage, lies. Behind her, Daniel said, there's one more thing. She did not turn immediately. There always is. This note wasn't in the compartment when I first found the photograph years ago. She faced him again. What? He nodded once. The photograph was there. The iron key too. But not the note. A chill moved through her. So someone put it there recently. Yes. After the break-in. Or just before. She stared at him. Then whoever broke into the boathouse either missed it intentionally or left it intentionally. That's my thought. Elena let out a breath that felt almost like disbelief. That is an absurd way to communicate. It may have been the safest one available. Safe for whom? Daniel didn't answer. Which was answer enough. For someone inside the circle, she thought. Someone who could not be seen passing messages openly. Her eyes drifted to the photograph again. A younger Daniel beside her father. Herself between them, solemn and windblown. All of them standing in front of this very room before it became a chamber of riddles. "What happened that summer?" she asked quietly. Daniel's expression altered. Not surprised this time. Something gentler, more cautious. "The first summer you came here?" "Yes." He seemed to consider the best place to begin. "Your father had only started tracing the Greyhaven records then," he said. He was curious, but not yet obsessed. "He told me he needed a few quiet days to compare maps and speak to an archivist in the next town. He brought you because your usual sitter was ill." Elena searched her memory. Only fragments came. Bright ones. Incomplete. A gull feather tied to string. A red tin of biscuits. The taste of apples eaten outdoors. Her father's sleeve smelling like salt. "He was happier?" she asked. Daniel was silent for half a second longer than the question required. "Yes," he said. The answer hurt in a different way than she expected. Not because it was painful to imagine her father happy. Because it implied a version of him that later vanished. What changed? Daniel looked at the chart rather than at her. He found his first proof that Greyhaven's harbor records had been altered. That was enough? No. But it was the kind of thing that made him impossible to distract. Elena almost smiled sadly at that. Yes. That was exactly the kind of thing that would have caught him and never let go. He also met someone, Daniel added. She looked up sharply. Who? A woman named Miriam Shaw. The name meant nothing. Should it? Not yet, Daniel said. But I think it will. That answer irritated her instantly. Stop doing that. Doing what? Speaking like a locked drawer. His mouth shifted, almost despite himself. I wasn't aware that was a recognized style. It is now. A pause. Then, unexpectedly, he said, Miriam kept records for a solicitor here 30 years ago. Later she worked privately, copying papers for local families, including the Mercers. By the time your father met her, she was old, half-blind, and sharper than anyone in town. Elena stepped back toward the workbench. And she told him something important. Yes. What? That certain documents were made to vanish in pairs. She frowned. What does that mean? If a letter disappeared from one collection, its corresponding record disappeared elsewhere. Bills of sale, harbor entries, wills, land claims, marriage licenses. Not random theft. Deliberate balancing. Someone cleaning history. Exactly. And she named names? No. But she did say something your father wrote down more than once. Elena waited. Daniel spoke the words carefully, as if he had held them for a long time. If a family protects one shame for long enough, it can bury 3 others beneath it. The sentence lingered between them. Elena thought of Isabel Mercer. A vanished woman in 1889. A shipwreck. A hidden cove. Coastal property. Altered records. One shame, she said. The scandal everyone knows. And the others hidden beneath. Her pulse quickened. Then Isabel Mercer isn't the whole story. No, Daniel said quietly. I don't think she ever was. They left the boathouse just before the light began to thin toward evening. Daniel locked the side door and checked the frame once more before turning away. Elena watched his hands do it. Precise, practiced, never hurried. A man accustomed to securing fragile things against intrusion. The walk back took them along the shoreline path rather than through the town at first. The sea lay stretched beside them in widening silver-gray bands. Far offshore, fishing boats had become dark notches against the horizon. For a while they walked without speaking. Elena's thoughts moved in loops. The red ledger. Miriam Shaw. Documents disappearing in pairs. A family protecting one shame to bury three others. Then the note in her pocket, which felt hotter than paper should. At last she said, "Where is Miriam Shaw now?" Daniel looked ahead. Dead. She should have expected it. Still, disappointment came. When? 8 years ago. Did my father see her often? Often enough. Do you know where she lived? Yes. Show me. Daniel slowed slightly but did not stop. There's nothing there now. I'd still like to see it. He looked at her, measuring. Today? Yes. He considered the light, the road, perhaps her face. Then nodded once. All right. Miriam Shaw's cottage stood at the far north end of Greyhaven, where the land began to rise and the houses grew farther apart. Or what remained of the cottage stood there. It had burned years ago. Elena knew that before Daniel said it. The ruin announced itself from a distance in blackened stone and a chimney left standing like a solitary witness. Brambles and pale weeds had grown through the collapsed footprint of the place. One shutter, half burnt and hanging from a single hinge, knocked softly against the ruin in the wind. Elena stopped at the broken gate. She lived here alone? Yes. And it burned accidentally. Daniel said nothing. She looked sideways at him. That means no. He exhaled. The official cause was a stove fire. And your unofficial cause? Timing. She stepped through the gate carefully. The ground was uneven with rubble hidden under grass. What happened before the fire? Your father had visited her 2 days earlier. Elena turned sharply. And then? Then someone broke into her cottage. The following night it burned. Cold moved through her. Was she inside? No. She was already gone. Gone how? Daniel's expression was grim. Buried. Quietly. An apparent stroke, according to the doctor. Elena stared at the ruin. No roof. No windows. No records. Nothing but weathered remnants and silence. Convenient again, she said softly. Yes. She moved toward the standing chimney. At its base, half covered by dead grass, lay a cracked square of blue and white tile. The pattern was delicate. Domestic. A remnant of an ordinary kitchen. For one moment the thought of an old woman sitting here in lamplight, copying papers she understood too well, struck Elena with surprising sadness. She told him too much. I think so. Did she leave anything behind? Not that I found. Not that you found, Elena repeated. Daniel let that pass. Elena crouched near the remains of the hearth. Most of the interior had long since collapsed and weathered. But among the ash-stained stones and dirt, fragments remained. Charred wood, melted glass, rusted nails. Then she saw a glint. Not bright. Muted and small. She reached in and picked it up. A brass button. No, not a button. A seal. Round, worn smooth at the edges, engraved on one face with a stylized M inside a crest of waves. Daniel. He took it from her and frowned. I've seen this before. Where? On old Mercer documents. She felt a jolt of triumph followed immediately by caution. So the Mercers were here. Or someone carrying something that belonged to them. That's generous. He turned the seal over in his fingers. It could have been dropped before the fire. Or long after. But it's still something. Yes. He tucked it carefully into the satchel. Elena straightened and brushed dirt from her hands. The light was lowering quickly now, the kind of coastal dusk that arrives with little ceremony, only a gradual draining of color from the world. Where do we go next? Daniel looked toward town. Home first. The word landed strangely. She noticed. So did he, Because his mouth altered slightly as if he had heard it too. The house, he corrected. Good. He nodded once. Then we read the notebook properly. Elena's brows lifted. You think I won't fall asleep over it? I think you might, but I also think the code in it is easier to see now. They turned back toward the road. By the time Greyhaven's first harbor lights began to glow, the sky had deepened into a soft indigo and the sea below held the last of the evening like tarnished silver. The house on Cliff Road seemed different in twilight. Less forbidding than on the storm night of Elena's arrival. The light in the windows looked almost welcoming against the dim coast, and smoke from the chimney rose in a thin straight line into the cooling air. Inside, Daniel lit lamps while Elena took off the borrowed oilskin coat and hung it by the door. The domestic familiarity of the motion startled her. She stepped away from it at once and moved to the fire instead. Daniel brought the notebook, the coastal chart, and the tin case to the table. Elena added the note from the boathouse, the second letter, and the silver lighthouse charm. Together the objects made the tabletop look like a private archive assembled in haste. Daniel lit one more lamp and set it closer. Sit. She did. The room warmed slowly as the fire took hold. Outside, night settled over the cliffs. Inside, pages whispered under their hands. For the next hour they worked in near silence. Not uncomfortable silence this time. Concentrated. Elena read the notebook from the beginning while Daniel cross-checked certain entries against the map. Her father's writing shifted over time from observational to guarded. He began by naming places directly: harbor, reef, Mercer House, church archive. Then gradually replaced names with symbols, phrases, and references that at first looked almost poetic. The widow watches from the east field. The third bell does not ring for God. The black water opens when the moon is absent. Find what was buried after the shame. Elena rubbed her eyes. This is infuriating. Daniel, beside her, did not look up from the chart. Yes. He wrote like a puzzle when he wanted to prevent easy theft. I know. No, I mean deliberately theatrical puzzle writing. That made Daniel glance up. Very briefly, he smiled. A real smile this time, quiet and unguarded and gone almost before she could fully see it. Yes, he said. That too. It changed his face more than she expected. Made him look younger. Or perhaps simply more human in a way she had not let herself notice. Elena looked back down quickly. She told herself it was because the notebook mattered. Which it did. Still, she became newly aware of the space between their chairs, the occasional brush of a sleeve when one of them reached for the map, the low nearness of his voice when he leaned in to point at something. Dangerous, she thought. Not because of him exactly. Because of timing. Fatigue. Uncertainty. The terrible intimacy of shared obsession. She forced her attention back to the page. Here, she said. This entry repeats the phrase after the shame 3 times. Daniel leaned closer. The notebook line read. They cover the first disgrace with mourning, the second with marriage, the third with stone. Search what was buried after the shame, not before it. Elena tapped the words. Mourning. Marriage. Stone. Daniel's expression sharpened. Miriam saying. She nodded. One shame burying 3 others. He reached for the folder from the previous night and flipped through copied records. Isabel Mercer disappeared in October 1889, he said. The orpheline was lost the same month. Then. He found another page. Then in January 1890, Adrian Mercer married a woman from Harrow's End. Adrian being? Isabel's older brother. Elena followed the thought. Mourning, marriage, stone. Daniel looked at her. And stone could mean a grave. Or a building. Or a marker. They both went still. Elena's eyes moved slowly to the notes on the table. Your father's marker, she said. Daniel frowned. Too recent. No. Not that one. She turned the folder toward herself. What stone was raised after Isabel disappeared? He searched faster now, pages whispering under his fingers. There. A newspaper clipping. Foundation stone laid for Mercer Memorial Chapel, spring 1890. Elena stared at it. There was a chapel? Daniel nodded slowly. On old Mercer land. Near the reef mark on the chart. Yes. The pulse in Elena's throat quickened. Then the shame was Isabel's disappearance. Mourning was the shipwreck narrative. Marriage was Adrian Mercer's wedding. Stone was the memorial chapel. Daniel's voice lowered. And your father is telling us to search what was buried after. The room seemed to contract around the realization. Buried where? Elena asked. Daniel looked at the chart, then back to the clipping. The chapel ruin. She rose so abruptly her chair scraped the floor. We're going. Daniel stood too, but more slowly. Not tonight. Why not? Because whatever is there has been there for over a century. It can survive until morning. What if someone else gets there first? What if someone expects us to rush there in the dark? She opened her mouth to argue. Then stopped. Because he was right. And because, frustratingly, she knew it before he said it. Elena paced once to the fireplace and back. The house felt too small for her thoughts again. The second letter pushed us to the cove, she said. Maybe this is the next step whoever is watching wants. Maybe. That doesn't mean they're wrong. No. She folded her arms and stared at the chapel clipping. The fire popped softly. Daniel remained standing across the table, one hand resting near the notebook. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then he said, quietly enough that she almost missed it, "You're tired." She laughed under her breath. Is that all? No. She looked up. The room held very still. He seemed to choose his words carefully. You've had more of your past returned to you in 2 days than most people can bear well in a year, he said. You don't have to carry it as if it weighs nothing. Something in the gentleness of the sentence caught her off guard. Elena looked away first. That sounds almost kind, she said. It was intended to. She moved to the window. Outside, darkness lay over the sea, broken only by the far wink of a harbor light and the pale unrest of waves below the cliffs. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. If we find something under that chapel, and it proves he lived, I don't know what I'll do. Behind her, Daniel answered after a pause. No. She turned. Just no? His gaze was steady. No, he said. You don't. And you don't have to know yet. The simple mercy of that nearly undid her. She had spent years surviving around absences. Then 2 days in Greyhaven had filled those absences with too much texture, too much possibility, too much grief sharpened into new shapes. There were moments when she wanted certainty more than breath. And others when she feared it. Daniel seemed to understand that without her saying it. Which was perhaps why the silence between them now felt less defensive than before. He picked up the clipping and slipped it into the folder. We go at first light, he said. She nodded. Yes. A beat passed. Then another. Neither returned immediately to the table. The firelight moved gently over the room, warming the old wood, the books, the curve of the lamp glass. In that softened light Daniel looked less like a guardian of unfinished stories and more like a man who had been carrying one too long. Elena, he said. She lifted her eyes. There's something I should have told you sooner. The words stilled her. Not again, she thought. Not another fracture tonight. But she only said, what? His face had gone careful again. Not closed. Careful. The night your father disappeared, before he left the box with me, he told me something. Every muscle in her body seemed to tighten at once. What? Daniel held her gaze. He said that if he failed, and if you ever came here anyway, I was to tell you one sentence exactly as he gave it. Elena could hear the sea under the cliffs. The fire. Her own pulse. And you waited until now? Yes. Why? Because I was trying to determine whether giving it to you would help, or whether it would only drag you deeper before I understood enough. That decision was never yours. I know. A long silence. Then she said, "Tell me." Daniel's voice lowered. He said, "Ask Elena what she hid in the chapel wall." The room went perfectly still. Elena stared at him. For one bewildered second the sentence meant nothing at all. Then memory hit her, not like a wave but like a door flung open in the dark. Summer light. A ruined stone building. Her father kneeling to show her a loose block near the floor. A childish game. Secret treasure. Hide the pretty thing and remember where. Her own small hands pushing something into the gap. She gasped. Daniel moved instinctively, as if to catch her if she fell. But she was already gripping the back of the chair. I remember, she whispered. His face changed. What? There was a bead, she said, breathing too fast now. No. Not a bead. Blue glass. Smooth. From my mother's broken necklace. I wanted to keep it because it looked like sea water in sunlight. More memory rushed in. Her father smiling, distracted but indulgent. Telling her to choose a hiding place no one would think important. Children are good at finding the holes adults overlook. Elena lifted a hand to her mouth. He used me, she said. Daniel's voice came at once. No. He hid something there through me. You don't know that. But even as he said it, both of them knew she did. Or almost. The memory was incomplete but alive enough. A loose chapel stone. A child's hand. Something hidden. Her father's instruction years later from beyond absence. Ask Elena what she hid in the chapel wall. Not what she remembers. What she hid. Because he knew the answer had been placed in her by design. Tears rose suddenly, hot and furious, less from sadness than from the stunning intimacy of being woven into a secret without consent. Daniel took one slow step closer. Elena. She shook her head. Not at him exactly. At everything. He brought me there on purpose, she said. Even then. Yes, Daniel said quietly. The truth of it, spoken aloud, seemed to tilt the room. Elena pressed her palms to her eyes, inhaled sharply, and lowered her hands again. When she looked at him, her face felt stripped bare. Then at first light is too late. Daniel's expression tightened. It's dark. I know. Cold. I know. If we go now. We go now, she said. Because if there is still something in that wall, and whoever has been watching us knows we're close, waiting until morning is the worst thing we can do. He held her gaze. She saw the argument still there in him. Saw it measure risk, terrain, night, tide. Then something else moved behind it. Recognition. Of the same stubbornness, perhaps, that had once belonged to her father. At last Daniel exhaled. All right. The word was reluctant, controlled, final. He crossed immediately to the coat hooks. Then you wear the oilskin again, take the stronger flashlight, and stay exactly where I tell you if the ground turns bad. Elena almost objected to the tone. Almost. Instead she nodded. Because the memory of the chapel wall was beating inside her now like a second pulse. And somewhere out there beyond the dark cliffs and old family lies, a child's hiding place might still be waiting. With a blue glass bead. Or something hidden behind it. Or the beginning of the true story at last. Chapter 6, The Chapel Ruin. They left the house under a moonless sky. The lamps in Grey Haven had already gone dim behind drawn curtains, and the harbor lights below looked small and far away, as if the town had chosen not to watch where they were going. Daniel carried 2 flashlights, a lantern, and the satchel. Elena wore the oilskin again over her own coat, her hands cold inside her gloves, her father's note and the silver lighthouse charm pressed like talismans against her chest. Neither of them spoke much on the road. The sea moved beside them in darkness, sounding larger than it looked. A long, breathing blackness with pale edges where the waves found rock. Overhead the clouds had thinned, but not enough for stars. The night seemed built from depth rather than distance. The old Mercer Chapel stood on high ground beyond the fields north of the hidden cove. By day it might have looked mournful. At night it looked abandoned by time itself. Only part of it remained. 2 roofless stone walls, 1 arched window frame open to the sky, and the front steps sinking into grass. Ivy had claimed the east side. Wind moved through the empty window and made a low, unsteady sound that could almost have been a voice. Elena stopped at the broken gate. "This is it," she said softly. Not a question. Something in her recognized the shape of the doorway. The angle of the wall. The worn step where years of weather had smoothed the stone. Daniel lifted the lantern. "You remember." "A little." She stepped through the gate before he could answer. The chapel yard was uneven, overgrown, and wet underfoot. Grass brushed her boots. The ruins smelled of damp stone and ivy. At some point in the past there had been small graves here too, perhaps for the family, perhaps for no one at all. A few low markers still lay half swallowed by moss. The front arch was cracked but standing. Beyond it, the chapel interior opened like a hollow ribcage to the night. Elena crossed the threshold. The air inside felt colder. Daniel followed, setting the lantern on a broken ledge where it lit the walls in warm, wavering gold. The shadows lengthened upward through the empty window frame and vanished into black sky. For a moment Elena simply stood there. Then memory moved through her in fragments. Sunlight instead of dark. Her father kneeling. Dust motes in warm air. Her own small hand holding a blue piece of glass and believing it was treasure. She turned slowly toward the side wall. "Here," she whispered. Daniel came closer. "I think it was here." The stones were old and uneven, the mortar worn in places to dark seams. Ivy roots had entered some of the cracks. One section near the floor looked slightly different, less weathered, or perhaps once disturbed and reset. Elena crouched. The lantern light trembled across the wall. She touched one stone, then another. "No," she murmured. "Lower." Her fingers found a small hollow at the edge of a block, just enough for a child's hand to notice. Her pulse quickened. "This one." Daniel knelt beside her. "Can it be moved?" "I don't know." He ran careful fingers along the seam. "Not by force. Not without damaging it." Elena sat back on her heels and closed her eyes. She tried to remember not the place, but the action. Her father's voice, patient and amused. "Hide it where no one important will look." Children understand secret places better than grown men. Then another detail surfaced. A stick. No, thinner than a stick. A metal pin. She opened her eyes. "There was something else," she said. "A tool." Daniel looked at her. "What kind?" "I don't know." "Thin." "Like a nail, maybe." He opened the satchel and searched through a small roll of practical things, twine, knife, matches, pencil, folded cloth, and produced a narrow iron marlinspike. Elena took it. Her hand shook slightly. She inserted the point into the hollow and pushed. Nothing. She adjusted the angle and tried again, this time farther upward. There was a faint click. Both of them went still. Again, Daniel said quietly. Elena pressed once more. The stone shifted. Only a fraction. But enough. Daniel set one hand against the lower edge and eased it outward. It came free with a gritty scrape, heavier than expected. Together they lowered it onto the grass. Behind it lay a cavity no larger than a loaf of bread. Inside was a small oilskin packet tied with decayed cord. For a second Elena could only stare. So little. And yet it seemed to pull all the air from the ruin. Daniel looked at her, not reaching for it. "You should." She swallowed and nodded. The packet was dry, protected by the wall and wrapped with extraordinary care. When she lifted it out, something small clicked inside against something flat. Her fingers remembered before her mind did. Yes, she thought. This weight. This hidden thing. Her father had indeed used her tiny act of play as camouflage for something deliberate. She untied the cord. Inside were 3 items. A blue glass bead, smooth and oval, no larger than her thumbnail. A folded paper sealed in wax long since cracked. And a small brass key. Elena stared down at the bead first. Sea-colored, exactly as she had remembered. For one strange second, grief softened into something else, an almost unbearable tenderness. Her father had kept the bead there too. Had not taken it out and replaced it with only his own secret. He had left her part of the game intact. Daniel seemed to understand what she was looking at. He left it. Yes, she whispered. She set the bead carefully on her palm and turned to the sealed paper. The wax had broken with time. The paper unfolded easily. Her father's handwriting. Only a few lines. "If this reaches you, I was right to mistrust the wreck story. The ledger is not in the chapel. The chapel is only the memory key. Take the brass key to the place where stone remembers the sea indoors. Do not trust the family records after 1890. Look for the child with no baptism and the bride with no grave." Elena read it twice, then lifted her head. The place where stone remembers the sea indoors. Daniel was already thinking, his expression taut and intent. "A floor," he said. "A floor? Stone remembering the sea indoors. Tiled perhaps. Or wave-cut rock used as foundation." He looked toward the broken arch, then back to her. "Some were built from coastal stone. Some were old." Elena looked down at the note again. "The child with no baptism and the bride with no grave." "Isabel," Daniel said. "Or the woman Adrian Mercer married after her disappearance." "And the child?" He shook his head slowly. "I don't know yet." Elena picked up the brass key. It was smaller than the iron key from the boathouse and finer in make. Old, but elegant. Not a storage key. Something private. She slipped the note back into the packet. A sharp sound outside made both of them turn. Footsteps. Close. Daniel blew out the lantern at once. Darkness crashed down around them. Elena's breath caught. A beam of light swept across the chapel yard from beyond the broken gate. Then another. 2 people at least. Daniel's hand found her wrist in the dark and closed firmly. "Stay." The word was unspoken, but clear. The lights moved across the grass, then through the arch. One figure remained outside while the other entered the ruined chapel. Elena could hear boots on stone. A man's voice, low and irritated, "Someone's been here." Another voice from outside, "Then find it." Daniel's grip tightened once and released. A warning. Elena backed silently toward the side wall, crouching low behind fallen stone. She could barely see Daniel now, only a darker shape within darkness. The flashlight beam slid across the opposite wall, then the floor. One more step and the man would see the removed block. Elena's heart hammered so hard she thought it must be audible. The beam stopped. "Damn," the man muttered. "It's open." The second voice came nearer. "Are they still here?" No sign. The first man kicked at the loose stone on the floor. The sound echoed horribly. Daniel moved then. Quick, silent, from the left side of the ruin. He struck the man's flashlight hand hard enough to send the beam spinning into the grass. The light wheeled wildly. The man swore. The second figure lunged through the arch. "Elena, go," Daniel said. She did not think. She ran. Out through the broken side gap where the wall had fallen long ago, into wet grass, up the dark rise behind the chapel. Branches caught at her sleeves. Her boots slipped on mud. Behind her came the thud of feet, a shout, then the crack of something hitting stone. She turned once. The chapel yard was chaos of moving beams and shadows. Daniel was between the two men, one already bent over, the other swinging clumsily in the dark. The lantern had been kicked and rolled, its weak flame guttering sideways in the grass. "Elena!" Daniel shouted again, sharper this time. "Run!" She ran. Fear and fury carried her over the field until the ruined wall was half lost behind gorse and darkness. Then she stopped, bent double, gasping. She could not leave him. The thought arrived fully formed and left no room for argument. Elena looked down at what she still held. The blue bead. The brass key. The note. Safe in her hand. She shoved them into her coat pocket and turned back. By the time she reached the chapel wall again, the struggle had moved toward the gate. One of the men had fled. The other was on the ground, trying to get up. Daniel stood over him, breathing hard, one sleeve torn, blood dark along one knuckle. The man twisted, then tore free and bolted into the dark before Daniel could grab him again. Silence followed in ragged pieces. The remaining flashlight lay on its side in the grass, throwing a long pale stripe over broken stones. Elena stepped through the gate. Daniel turned instantly. "You came back." His voice was halfway between anger and relief. "Yes. You were supposed to run." "I did." Briefly. He looked at her for one long second, then exhaled through his teeth and bent to pick up the fallen flashlight. "Are you hurt?" she asked. "No. That hand says otherwise." "It'll keep." He swept the beam over the yard, confirming what they already knew. Both men gone. No clear view of faces. No names. Only proof that someone else knew exactly what mattered about the chapel wall. Daniel straightened. "Did you get it?" Elena touched her pocket. "Yes." "Good." His voice had changed. Tighter now. More urgent. "We leave. Now." They did not return by the open road. Instead, Daniel led her across the upper field and down a narrower track between hedges, moving fast and listening often. Once, when Elena slipped on wet ground, he caught her by the elbow and did not let go for the next 30 paces. Neither mentioned it. By the time the house came into sight above the cliffs, both of them were breathing hard from speed and cold. Inside, Daniel locked the door, checked the back entrance, drew the curtains, and only then turned toward her. The fire had burned low. The room felt suddenly too bright and too close after the dark open fields. Elena took the packet from her pocket and set its contents on the table. Blue bead. Brass key. Her father's note. Daniel stood opposite her, one hand braced on the table edge, the torn sleeve hanging open at the wrist. Blood had dried across his knuckles after all. "You're hurt," she said. "It's nothing." She gave him a look. Without argument this time, he went to the sideboard for water and clean cloth. Elena took them from his hands and pointed toward the chair. "Sit." He obeyed, though with the expression of a man who preferred not to be managed. She cleaned the cut in silence. It was shallow. Scraped skin and one split knuckle. Nothing worse. Daniel watched her once or twice, then looked away toward the fire. "You should have kept running," he said at last. "You should stop telling me what I should have done after the fact. That is a poor system for survival. So is vanishing into fights in ruined chapels." The corner of his mouth moved despite himself. "Fair. She wrapped the hand with more firmness than necessary. There. Thank you. She set the cloth aside and returned to the table. The note waited between them. The place where stone remembers the sea indoors, she said. What is it? Daniel's eyes went to the blue bead, then the brass key, then the words again. Not the chapel. Not the boathouse. Somewhere with worked stone. Older than recent Mercer holdings if your father distrusted records after 1890. Elena thought of the town. The church? No. The harbor office? Too obvious. Then another memory rose, small and almost trivial, the blue and white tile at Miriam Shaw's ruined cottage hearth. She looked up sharply. Miriam's cottage. Daniel frowned. Burned. The hearth survived. And there was tile. He stood at once. Nazi stone indoors. No. But maybe she copied something from another place. Or maybe. He was already reaching for the folder. There was another Mercer property used as a retreat before the cliff fall, he said. A house known for its conservatory floor. Bluestone imported from the coast. Locals called it the Tidemark House. Elena stared. That sounds absurdly poetic. It was a wealthy family. They tend to decorate their crimes. Where is it? Daniel opened the chart drawer and pulled out a smaller landmap. South of town. The shell remains, at least. Most of it was abandoned after the war. She looked at the brass key. You think this opens something there? I think your father wanted us to think so. A pause. Then Elena said, then we go now. Daniel actually laughed once under his breath, tired and incredulous. Of course you say that. You object? Yes. Will it stop us? He looked at her. In the firelight his face seemed both more worn and more alive than before. Adrenaline still lingered in him. Concern too. And something else she was trying, not very successfully, not to name. No, he said. That simple answer crossed the room between them like a live wire. Elena looked down first. Practicality returned in a rush. We need a plan. We need 15 minutes, Daniel said. To eat something, warm up, and think whether the men at the chapel were sent to watch, to retrieve, or to prevent. All three. Likely. He poured water into 2 glasses and handed one to her. Their fingers touched. Just briefly. Still, the contact seemed to sharpen the silence. Elena took the glass and drank. The house was quiet now except for the sea below the cliffs and the soft shifting of the fire. After the rush from the chapel, the stillness felt almost intimate. Too intimate. She turned back to the note so she would not have to look at him. The child with no baptism, she said. If there was a child hidden from the record, then Isabel Mercer may not have simply disappeared. No, Daniel said quietly. She may have been erased. Elena let the words settle. A bride with no grave. A child with no baptism. One shame hiding 3 others. The mystery was changing shape again. Becoming less about treasure and more about blood, inheritance, and the ways powerful families rewrote what they could not bear to acknowledge. Then the ledger, she said, might not be about shipping at all. Daniel's gaze sharpened. No. It could be a family record. Private names. Payments. Births. Settlements. Or proof of who had to vanish to keep property where it was. They looked at each other. Both arriving at the same thought. If the red ledger existed, it might not expose a crime of money alone. It might expose a crime of lineage. And that, Elena understood now, was the kind of secret people protected across generations. She rested one hand on the table to steady herself. When this ends, she said, not fully meaning to speak aloud, nothing in this town will remain simple. Daniel's voice was low. I don't think it ever was. Silence again. Not empty. Warm from the fire and strained from everything unspoken. Elena became suddenly aware that she was standing very close to him. That his bandaged hand rested near hers on the tabletop. That the torn edge of his sleeve made him look less composed, less untouchable. He saw her looking. And for 1 suspended second neither of them moved. Then Daniel stepped back first. A deliberate kindness. Or caution. Or both. "We leave in 15 minutes, he said. Elena nodded. Yes. But as she gathered the bead, the note, and the brass key, her pulse had nothing to do with hidden ledgers or Mercer ruins. And that frightened her almost as much as the men at the chapel. Because danger from outside was easy to name. This was not. This was the beginning of wanting to trust someone at the exact moment she had the most reason not to. Outside, the tide turned below the cliffs. Inside, the fire rose. And somewhere beyond Greyhaven, in a ruined house where stone remembered the sea indoors, the next answer waited. Chapter 7, Tidemark House. Tidemark House stood south of Greyhaven behind a line of wind-stripped pines, half hidden from the road by a collapsed stone wall and years of neglect. Even in the dark, Elena could see what it had once been. The front steps were wide, though one side had sunk. Tall windows faced the sea, most of them broken now, the remaining panes reflecting the lantern light in jagged pieces. Ivy had spread across one wing and climbed over the old iron balcony like something determined to erase elegance by patience alone. "It looks haunted," Elena said quietly. "It's only wealthy and abandoned," Daniel replied. "People often confuse the two." She gave him a brief look. "That was better. Thank you." They crossed the overgrown drive. The gravel had almost vanished under moss and weeds. Somewhere inside the shell of the house, wind moved through broken rooms with a low, hollow sound. Daniel tried the side entrance first. Locked. He stepped back, raised the lantern, and studied the frame. "Elena." She turned the brass key over in her gloved hand. "You think this is it?" "I think your father was rarely ornamental." She handed him the key. The lock was old and stiff. For a moment it resisted. Then, with a dull metal click, it turned. Both of them went still. Daniel opened the door slowly. The air inside smelled of dust, salt, mildew, and stone that had held damp for decades. Their lights moved over a long corridor, stripped wallpaper, sagging ceiling plaster, and a line of framed spaces where paintings had once hung. The house had been emptied in stages. Not by thieves alone, Elena thought, but by history. "What exactly are we looking for?" she asked. "Stone that remembers the sea indoors," Daniel said. "That still sounds like a poem." "It may also be a floor." They moved carefully from room to room. A dining room with a collapsed ceiling. A library with shelves still clinging to one wall. A drawing room facing the cliffs, where pale moonlight through broken windows touched a grand piano reduced to warped wood and ruin. Then Daniel stopped at a pair of half-open doors at the far end of the house. Beyond them lay a long conservatory. Or what had once been one. The glass roof was mostly gone, leaving the space open to the night. Ferns and wild grass had taken root along the edges. But the floor remained. Blue-gray stone tiles, veined like water. Even under dust and fallen leaves, they shimmered faintly where the lantern light touched them. Elena stepped inside. "This is it." "Yes." The tiles were laid in a wave pattern, curving outward from the center of the room. At the far end stood a dry fountain built of the same stone. One section of the floor near it looked slightly darker than the rest. Daniel crouched. "Help me with the leaves." Together they brushed away damp debris. A narrow iron ring appeared, set flush into one tile. Elena's pulse jumped. Daniel hooked his fingers beneath it and pulled. Nothing. "Wait." Elena knelt beside him and held the lantern lower. "The seam is packed." Daniel took the knife from the satchel and cleared the edges. Then he pulled again. the tile lifted. Beneath it was a shallow cavity containing a red leather ledger wrapped in oilcloth. For one breathless moment neither of them moved. The ledger was real. Her father had been right. Daniel lifted it out and set it carefully on the dry edge of the fountain basin. The leather had darkened with age, but the color remained visible under the grime. On the cover, stamped faintly in gold, were the initials MM. Mercer Memorial? Elena whispered. Or Miriam Shaw's own notation, Daniel said. Open it. She did. The first pages were not what she expected. No ship manifests. No treasure maps. Names. Dates. Payments. Private notes in at least 3 different hands across many years. Children listed without formal family names. Women paid to travel. Land parcels transferred quietly. Clergy fees marked beside missing entries. Sums paid to midwives, doctors, solicitors. Erasure written down as bookkeeping. Elena turned pages faster. Isabel Mercer's name appeared once, then vanished into initials. A later entry mentioned the child removed from parish record. Another, marriage advanced for preservation of title. Another, underlined, no grave marker. Daniel leaned over her shoulder, reading in silence. At last Elena stopped on a page near the middle. There, in her father's handwriting on an inserted loose sheet, was one sentence. The wreck was used to bury scandal, but the scandal was used to bury inheritance. Elena stared at it. The child, she said. The child with no baptism wasn't a servant's baby or some side note. The child mattered to the title. Daniel nodded slowly. Which means Isabel Mercer may have had an heir whose existence threatened the line that followed. And if she vanished, and the records vanished with her, then the estate passed where someone wanted it to pass. The scale of it settled over the room like a second darkness. Not just old cruelty. Architecture of cruelty. Sustained for generations. Elena turned another page. The later entries changed. Less personal. More defensive. References to documents relocated, witness payments, and the maintenance of the maritime narrative. She looked up sharply. The shipwreck story. Yes. They kept using it. Daniel's face had gone hard. As a family legend. As explanation. As distraction. Elena closed the ledger halfway and took a breath. What about my father? Why would this get him killed or hidden? Daniel answered without hesitation. Because if he proved the wreck story was false in the way they used it, then the rest might crack open too. A sound behind them made both of them turn. Not footsteps this time. A floorboard. Very slight. But not the house settling. Daniel lowered the lantern instantly. Someone was in Tidemark House. He took the ledger from Elena and pushed it back into the satchel. Back door, she whispered. No. Too exposed. He scanned the conservatory once, eyes moving fast. Through there. A narrow service door stood half hidden behind climbing dead ivy. Daniel moved toward it. Elena followed. The door opened into a passage running behind the main rooms. Narrow, dark, smelling of rot and cold plaster. They had only gone a few steps when lantern light swept across the conservatory behind them. Voices. 2 men, maybe 3. One of them's been here. Search the floor. Daniel's hand closed around Elena's wrist again, and together they moved deeper into the passage. At the far end was a stair meant for servants, steep and cramped. It rose toward darkness above. Up? Elena whispered. No. Down. Below the first steps, half hidden behind paneling, was another door. Daniel shoved it open. Cellar. They went down into cold blackness just as the men entered the passage above. Daniel closed the cellar door without fully latching it. No light. No sound. Elena could hear her own breathing and the thud of blood in her ears. Above them, footsteps crossed the passage. One voice, muffled, checked downstairs too. Daniel leaned close, his breath warm against her temple in the dark. There may be an outer hatch. She nodded, though he could barely see it. They moved by touch. The cellar smelled of damp stone and old wine casks long removed. Daniel used the smallest shuttered beam from the flashlight only when necessary, aiming it low. Bare walls. Broken shelves. A drain. Then, at the far end, a narrow hatch set into the foundation where coal might once have been delivered. Daniel tried it. Stuck. He pushed harder. The wood groaned. Dirt shifted outside. Above them the footsteps on the stair began to descend. Elena, Daniel said quietly. She put both hands against the hatch beside his. Together they shoved. The hatch burst outward into wet earth and winter grass. Cold night air rushed in. They crawled out behind the house just as lantern light appeared at the top of the cellar steps. Then they ran. Not toward the road. Toward the cliff path where darkness and scrub gave cover. The satchel thudded against Daniel's side. Elena nearly lost one boot in mud, caught herself, and kept going. Behind them came a shouted curse, then another. The men had seen the open hatch. But the hillside was steep, tangled, and unfamiliar unless you knew it. Daniel did. He led her through a break in the stone wall, down a sheep track, then into a hollow between ridges where the wind drowned lesser sounds. Only when they had put real distance between themselves and Tidemark House did he stop. Both of them were breathing hard. Elena bent forward, hands on her knees. This town, she managed between breaths, has an exhausting number of men appearing in the dark. Daniel let out one short laugh. Agreed. It was so unexpected that she straightened and looked at him. Moonlight had finally pushed through the clouds. Faint, but enough to silver the edges of his face. His hair was windblown. The cut on his hand had reopened through the bandage. And yet he looked more alive in that moment than she had seen him before. Danger suited him too well, she thought. That was not a comforting realization. Did they see the ledger? She asked. No. Good. He lifted the satchel slightly. Very. They started walking again, slower now, cutting across the upper fields toward the coast. For a while neither spoke. The adrenaline gradually gave way to something quieter. Then Elena said, "You knew there would be people there." "I thought it likely." "You still came." "Yes." She looked ahead into the dark. "So did I." Daniel was silent for a moment. Then, softly, "Yes." They reached the cliff line where the sea opened below them in pale strips under the moon. The sight steadied her. So did the wind. She stopped and turned toward him. "We need to read the ledger now." "Yes." "And then?" He looked at her for a long second. "Then we decide whether this is a family scandal," he said, "or whether it explains your father too." The words fell between them with weight. Elena searched his face. "You think his disappearance is in there?" "I think there's a chance the last pages were added later." "By whom?" He did not answer. Which meant he had a thought and did not yet trust it. Elena stepped closer without meaning to. The moonlight and distance from town made the moment feel cut loose from everything else. No house. No walls. Just the sea below and the wind and the man standing before her carrying part of her father's unfinished truth. "You don't have to protect me from every thought before you've tested it," she said quietly. Daniel's gaze held hers. "I know." "Then stop." He looked away first, toward the water. "When your father vanished," he said, "there were days I thought he had chosen to leave everything behind. Days I hated him for making that imaginable. And there were other days I thought he was dead because I failed him." His voice stayed level, but only just. "I learned to say nothing because every answer was a wound." Elena felt the honesty of it like a physical thing. The wind lifted her hair across her cheek. Daniel reached out as if by instinct, then stopped before touching her. The unfinished motion was worse than contact might have been. For one suspended moment, all the grief and danger and nearness between them seemed to narrow to that single almost touch. Then Elena said, very softly, "Come on." And the moment broke. They walked the rest of the way in silence. Back at the house, the lamps were lit low and the fire had nearly gone out. Daniel rebuilt it while Elena cleared the table. When the room warmed again, he set the red ledger between them and opened to the final section. The later pages were indeed different. Different ink. Different hand in places. Some entries had been crossed through. Others added hurriedly in margins. And near the back, on a page nearly torn loose, Elena found the line that stopped both of them cold. Marin removed from Cove Matter. Contained provisionally. Await confirmation from H. She looked up. Marin. Daniel's face had gone still. Her father. No doubt now. Contained, Elena whispered. What does that mean? Daniel read the line again, then the note below it. No burial. No public action until record exchange complete. The room seemed to tilt. Elena gripped the edge of the table. He was alive. Daniel's voice was rougher than before. Yes. Contained where? He turned the page. Nothing. Only accounts and names. Then, tucked into the back cover, folded twice and hidden in the leather lining, was one final slip of paper. Daniel removed it carefully and handed it to her. Not her father's hand. A woman's. Elegant. Controlled. If they failed to move him before the tide roads flood, use the East Keeper's room. No one looks there now. No signature. But beneath the line was impressed a seal Elena had seen earlier that day. The Mercer crest of waves. And in the lower corner, one penciled note in her father's hand. H equals Hales? Or Harrow? East Keeper equals Old Lighthouse? Elena looked up sharply. The lighthouse. Daniel was already standing. Yes. The old lighthouse stood on the eastern headland outside town, disused for years. And if her father had been taken there alive? The thought was impossible, absurd, 12 years too late. But no longer fully impossible. Elena rose too quickly, the chair falling behind her with a hard wooden crack. Daniel caught her arm before she lost balance. Both of them froze. His hand at her elbow. Her breath catching. The ledger opened between them like a wound finally speaking. Neither moved away at once. The fire shifted in the grate. The sea sounded below the cliffs. Elena lifted her eyes to his. Tonight? She asked. Daniel's hand loosened but did not leave her immediately. Yes, he said. And this time there was no argument at all. Because whatever waited in the old lighthouse, truth, absence, proof, or only one more ghost, they were past the point where either of them could bear another delay. Chapter 8, The East Keeper's Room. The lighthouse stood alone on the eastern headland. From a distance it looked less like a building and more like a memory left behind by the sea. The tower rose pale and narrow against the night sky, its lantern room dark, the glass long ago broken or removed. The smaller keeper's house beside it had sagged into ruin, roof half collapsed, the door hanging crooked on rusted hinges. No light burned anywhere on the headland. Only the sea. It sounded different here than below the cliffs near Daniel's house, louder, heavier, the waves striking exposed rock in slow booming intervals that echoed through the tower like distant thunder. Elena stood still for a moment. This place was abandoned? Officially, Daniel said. He lowered the lantern to shield its glow. After the harbor lights were automated 20 years ago. No one lived here after that. Except someone may have used it. Yes. She drew a breath. The wind off the sea was colder than earlier. It cut through the oilskin and carried a smell of kelp and stone. Daniel moved toward the keeper's house first. The door resisted when he pushed it, then opened with a long wooden groan. Inside, dust lay thick across the floor. Old furniture remained where it had been left, table, chair, a rusted stove. But it did not look recently disturbed. Daniel scanned the room quickly. No one's been here tonight. That doesn't mean never. No. He lifted the lantern again. Up there. The lighthouse tower door stood beyond the house, attached by a short covered walkway half collapsed by time. Elena followed him through it. The tower interior was narrow and circular, the stone walls damp and cold to the touch. A spiral stair climbed the inside curve toward darkness. But before the stairs, at ground level, a small door stood recessed into the wall. Iron latch. Heavy wood. Daniel stopped. The East Keeper's room. Elena's pulse jumped. Open it. He did. The door swung inward with surprising ease. Inside was a small square chamber. Bare stone walls. A single narrow window. A cot frame pushed against the far wall. And beneath the cot, a chain bolt fixed into the floor. Elena felt the air leave her lungs. He was here. Daniel stepped into the room slowly. The lantern light showed marks on the stone floor near the bolt. Old scratches. Rust stains. Not fresh, but real. Contained, Elena whispered. The ledger word returned with brutal clarity. Daniel crouched beside the bolt. Someone held him here. How long? I don't know. She looked around the room. It was small enough that a person could reach every wall without standing. The cot frame had once held a mattress, but only the wooden slats remained. In one corner stood a narrow shelf where a water jug might have been placed. Prison, not lodging. Elena's hands trembled. My father. Daniel stood again, his face tight with something deeper than anger. Whoever wrote the note expected him to be moved. Elena turned slowly. If they failed to move him before the tide roads flood, she recited. That means he was still alive when the message was written. Yes. Then why isn't he here? Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead he crossed the small room, testing the stone floor with careful pressure. One tile shifted slightly under his boot. He stopped. Elena. She came beside him. The stone was loose. Together they lifted it. Beneath was a shallow cavity holding a tin box. Smaller than the red ledger had been. Daniel handed it to her. Her fingers felt strangely numb as she opened the lid. Inside were three things. A pocket watch. A folded letter. And a small leather tag attached to a rusted key ring. Elena picked up the watch first. Her breath caught. It was her father's. She knew it instantly from the worn brass casing and the faint scratch near the hinge where she had dropped it as a child. He had kept it always. She opened it. The hands had stopped long ago. But inside the lid was still the inscription her mother had chosen. For Jonas, so you never lose time with us. Elena closed the watch carefully. The letter remained. She unfolded it slowly. The paper crackled. The handwriting. Her father's. Her throat tightened. Elena. If you are reading this, Daniel did not fail me. I chose to remain where they could see me until I knew which of them feared the ledger more than the wreck. If I escape, I will find you. If I do not, you must finish what I began. The truth in that book will break the Mercer story, but the Real inheritance lies with the child they erased. Follow Miriam's copies. Trust Daniel when he doubts himself. Your father. The words blurred. Elena pressed her hand to her mouth. He wrote this here, she whispered. Daniel looked at the paper. Yes. Her eyes moved to the final line again. Trust Daniel when he doubts himself. For a moment neither of them spoke. The sea struck the rocks below the tower with a heavy boom that rolled up through the stone. Elena folded the letter carefully. He knew, she said quietly. Daniel's voice was low. About me. Yes. A long silence followed. Then Elena lifted the leather tag from the box. Numbers were stamped into it. Locker 17, Greyhaven Harbor. Daniel frowned. A harbor locker. What's kept there? Storage compartments for boats. Equipment. Nets. Private? Yes. Elena looked at him. That's where the rest of the proof is. Possibly. And someone else may know it too. Daniel nodded grimly. After tonight, very likely. They stood there a moment longer. Then Elena said the words she had been holding back. He was alive when they wrote the ledger entry. Yes. And after this letter? Daniel met her gaze. I don't know. The truth was harsh, but it was the only one he had. Elena slipped the watch into her coat pocket beside the bead and key. We finish it. Daniel's expression hardened. Yes. They left the keeper's room and climbed the spiral stairs to the lantern platform above. From there the whole coastline of Greyhaven lay visible. The harbor lights. The dark ridge where the chapel stood. The faint outline of Tidemark House beyond the trees. And the town itself, quiet beneath the night. Elena leaned on the stone railing. My father believed the inheritance belonged to a child erased from record. Yes. If that child lived, then someone alive today might have a claim to Mercer land. And someone else has been protecting the lie for a century. Daniel looked out toward the harbor. Which means the harbor locker may hold the final proof. Elena nodded. Then we go there. Daniel checked his watch instinctively before remembering it had stopped years ago. Before dawn, he said. Before anyone expects us. Elena turned from the railing. For the first time since the night began, exhaustion pulled at her bones. Daniel noticed. You should sit for a moment. I'm fine. You're shaking. I'm angry. That too. A faint smile flickered across his face. Despite everything, she almost smiled back. Instead she sat on the stone step beside the lantern opening. Daniel remained standing near the railing. The wind moved around them. For a long minute neither spoke. Then Elena said quietly, You didn't fail him. Daniel looked down at her. You couldn't know that. I do now. She tapped the folded letter in her pocket. He wrote it. Something in Daniel's expression shifted. The guilt that had lived in him for 12 years did not vanish. But it loosened, slightly, like a knot finally touched by light. Thank you, he said. The words were simple. Elena stood again. Come on, she said softly. We still have one place left to search. They descended the tower together. Outside, the sea wind had grown stronger. Storm clouds were building again far out on the horizon. Greyhaven slept below them. But not for much longer. Because by sunrise, Elena knew, the story buried under a century of silence might finally be dragged into daylight. And someone in town would do anything to stop that from happening. Chapter 9, The Truth Beneath the Harbor. They reached Greyhaven Harbor just before dawn. The sky above the sea was beginning to pale into a cold silver gray, though the sun had not yet appeared. Fishing boats rocked gently against the docks, their masts creaking softly in the early wind. No one was moving yet. The town still belonged to night and tide. Daniel slowed as they approached the line of storage lockers built into the stone wall beside the old pier. Locker 17, he said quietly. Elena counted the numbers along the rusted metal doors. 14. 15. 16. 17. The locker looked no different from the others, weathered metal, chipped paint, and a heavy padlock hanging from the latch. Daniel crouched. Try the key. Elena took the rusted ring from her pocket. The leather tag brushed her fingers as she slid the key into the lock. For a second nothing happened. Then the lock turned. The metal door creaked open. Inside the locker was a narrow storage compartment barely 3 feet deep. Fishing crates. A coiled rope. A wooden box wrapped in oilcloth. Daniel lifted it out and placed it on the dock between them. The sky was growing lighter now. They had minutes at most before fishermen began appearing. Elena untied the cloth. Inside the box were 3 thick bundles of paper tied with twine. And beneath them, a small sealed envelope. Daniel picked up the first bundle. "Copies," he said quietly. Elena leaned closer. The papers were records. Birth registers. Marriage licenses. Property transfers. And beside them were the matching entries from the red ledger. But these were originals. Stamped. Signed. Official. Someone had removed them from the archives decades ago. Elena turned one page and froze. Isabel Mercer. Name crossed out in church record. Then beneath it another entry. Child, unnamed. Mother, Isabel Mercer. Father, Jonas Marin. Elena stared. Her breath left her in a slow, shocked exhale. "My father," she whispered. Daniel went very still. The implication unfolded between them piece by piece. Isabel Mercer had not vanished because of scandal. She had been pregnant. And the father had not been some unknown servant or passing sailor. It had been Jonas Marin. But not the Jonas Marin Elena knew. The name repeated. A family name. Passed down. Daniel read the next page. Jonas Marin the first, he said slowly. Elena. Elena felt the pieces click together. My father's family. Yes. Which means the child Isabel had was your ancestor. The truth landed with quiet finality. The Mercer fortune had been built on land and title that legally should have belonged to the Marin line. The shipwreck story had hidden a pregnancy. The disappearance had hidden an heir. And the Mercer family had erased the record to keep control. Elena looked at the envelope still resting inside the box. Her hands were suddenly unsteady. Open it, Daniel said softly. She did. Inside was a final letter. Not old. Not from her father. Written only recently. Elena unfolded it. The handwriting was elegant and precise. M. Mercer. Her eyes scanned the page. Then widened. She knew, Elena said. Daniel leaned closer. The letter was short. Miss Marin. If you have reached this locker, then Daniel has done what Jonas asked of him. The truth is here because I chose not to bury it with the rest of my family's lies. Isabel Mercer was my great-grandmother. She was hidden, not dead. Her child was taken from her and raised elsewhere so the Mercer estate could remain intact. I cannot undo what was done, but I will not continue the silence. The harbor archives will open tomorrow morning. Bring the ledger and these records. The town will hear the truth. Mara Mercer. Elena looked up sharply. Mara Mercer. Daniel nodded slowly. The woman from the town council. The one who greeted me yesterday. Yes. Elena laughed quietly in disbelief. So she's been helping us. Or helping herself tell the truth. They stood there for a moment in the pale morning light. Then a voice behind them said calmly. That depends on how you look at it. Both of them turned. Mara Mercer stood at the end of the dock. Tall. Dark coat. Wind moving through her hair. She did not look surprised. I was hoping you'd reach the locker before the others, she said. Elena straightened. You sent the letters. Yes. Daniel's voice was steady. And the man at the chapel? Not mine, Mara replied. My uncle's. Elena frowned. The one who runs the Mercer Shipping Company? Mara nodded once. He believes the ledger should remain lost. And you don't? No. The wind moved across the harbor. Morning light had begun to touch the water. Elena held the papers tightly. You could have told me everything. Mara gave a faint, sad smile. If I had, you would never have trusted me. That was true. Daniel stepped closer to Elena. What happens now? Mara looked at the horizon. Now the truth is too large to hide again. She gestured to the box. Bring the records to the council chamber this morning. The archivist will verify them. After that, the Mercer estate belongs to the law. And to the Marin line, Elena said quietly. Yes. The town bells began to ring the first hour of morning. Fishermen appeared along the docks, unaware that the history of their town had just changed forever. Elena closed the box. For the first time since arriving in Greyhaven, the weight she carried felt different. Not lighter, but clearer. Daniel met her eyes. Ready? She nodded. Yes. And together they carried the truth toward the waking town. Chapter 10, The House Between Tides. Greyhaven changed slowly. Not with explosions of drama, but with the quiet force of truth finally spoken aloud. By midday the council chamber was full. The archivist verified the documents. The red ledger was read. The church records were matched. The name Isabel Mercer returned to history. And with it came the story that had been buried beneath a shipwreck for more than a century. A child taken from its mother. A fortune protected by silence. And a family who had been erased from it. The Marin family. Elena listened as the room filled with voices. Shock. Anger. Relief. Some of the older fishermen nodded as if they had suspected pieces of the story all their lives. Others simply stared. But the truth was there now. Written. Verified. Impossible to fold back into silence. When the meeting finally ended, the harbor outside was bright with afternoon light. Elena stood on the stone steps while the wind moved softly across the water. Behind her the council members were still arguing about legal consequences and land claims. Daniel joined her quietly. Well, he said. Well. She watched the sea. My father knew, she said after a moment. Yes. And he tried to finish it. Yes. Daniel rested his arms on the stone railing. He would be proud of you. Elena smiled faintly. I think he'd say I took too long. Daniel shook his head. No. They stood there in silence. The wind was warmer now. Spring moving slowly into the coast. After a moment Elena said, What happens to the Mercer estate? Daniel shrugged. Lawyers will fight over it for years. And the truth? That part is already finished. She turned toward him. You stayed here for 12 years. Yes. Waiting. Yes. For me? Daniel hesitated. Then answered honestly. For him, he said. Elena studied his face. The tired calm she had first seen in him was still there. But it looked different now. Less like someone guarding a wound. More like someone finally allowed to set it down. You know, she said quietly, you could leave Greyhaven now. I could. Will you? Daniel looked out at the sea. I haven't decided. Elena nodded slowly. That's fair. The tide had begun to rise. Waves touched the harbor stones and slipped back again. She felt the lighthouse charm in her pocket. Her father's watch beside it. Small reminders of everything that had brought her here. Daniel turned slightly. What will you do? Elena considered the question. She had arrived in Greyhaven chasing a ghost. Now the ghost had a story. And the story had an ending. I think, she said, I'll stay a little while. Daniel looked at her. A little while. Yes. The corner of his mouth lifted. I know a house on the cliffs that might have a spare room. Elena laughed softly. I've seen that house. And? It's quiet. Daniel nodded. Most nights. The wind carried the sound of gulls over the harbor. Elena watched the sea. Greyhaven no longer felt like a place holding its breath. The silence had changed. Not heavy. Not secret. Just the quiet of a town learning to live with its truth. After a moment Daniel spoke again. Elena. Yes? I'm glad you came. She looked at him. So am I. The tide continued to rise below them. And somewhere far out beyond the reefs, the sea moved endlessly between past and future. But for the first time in many years, the story between them had reached its shore. And neither of them needed to run from it anymore. The end.